Welcome to today's video where we dive deep into one of the most chilling and secretive operations in U.S. history, MKUltra. In this video, we'll uncover the truth behind the CIA's covert mind control experiments, the psychological and ethical implications, and how its dark legacy continues to influence government actions and pop culture today. From its disastrous impact on its victims to its ongoing relevance in modern conspiracy theories and surveillance technologies, we explore the lasting effects of MKUltra and the lessons we must learn from it. Stay tuned as we unpack the chilling truth that's been hidden in the shadows for decades. Chapter 1: The Birth of MKUltra. It's the early 1950s and the world is living in the shadow of the Cold War. The United States, gripped by an all-consuming fear of communism, is engaged in a constant battle of ideologies against the Soviet Union. In a time of political tension and paranoia, the CIA becomes increasingly obsessed with the idea of psychological warfare. The fear of communist influence, coupled with rumors of Soviet mind control techniques, drives the American intelligence community to explore new, often disturbing, ways to control and manipulate the human mind. At the heart of this growing paranoia is the belief that the Soviet Union may have discovered ways to break individuals mentally, rendering them not only vulnerable but utterly malleable. The American government's fear of being outpaced by Soviet advancements pushes them to take extreme measures. The CIA, under the leadership of Allen Dulles, sees an opportunity to gain an upper hand in this invisible war. Their solution: mind control. In 1953, the CIA formally launched MKUltra, a covert program that would forever alter the lives of countless individuals. The primary goal of MKUltra was to explore methods of mind control through drugs, hypnosis, and psychological manipulation. At the head of this secret operation was Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist with a background in biological warfare research. Gottlieb's curiosity was fueled by the belief that the human mind could be broken, manipulated, and controlled with the right combination of substances and techniques. He was determined to find the perfect truth serum, one that could force anyone to reveal their deepest secrets, and he had no qualms about the ethical implications. The early stages of MKUltra saw the CIA exploring various substances that might help them achieve this goal. LSD, a relatively new psychedelic drug discovered by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann in 1938, emerged as the primary tool for the program. The CIA had heard rumors about LSD's ability to alter consciousness, and they saw it as a potential key to unlocking the ability to control minds. It was quickly added to the CIA's list of experimental substances. The CIA began dosing a wide array of subjects with LSD, testing the effects of the drug on their behavior and mental state. Some of the first experiments were conducted on military personnel who were dosed without their knowledge, followed by more civilians, also unwitting participants in the CIA's secret program. The results were shocking and terrifying. Those who were dosed often experienced extreme psychological distress, ranging from violent outbursts to deep paranoia, and in some cases, the effects were so severe that the subjects were left with long-lasting mental scars. One of the most disturbing aspects of MKUltra was the CIA's complete disregard for consent. Individuals were not informed that they were part of an experiment, nor were they given any indication of the risks involved. The agency's leadership, driven by a singular goal of controlling the human mind, cared little for the well-being of the subjects. As the program continued to grow, the CIA sought new ways to increase its reach and refine its methods. Sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and electroshock therapy were soon added to the list of techniques being tested. For the subjects involved, the line between reality and nightmare quickly blurred. In one of the more infamous experiments, the CIA subjected individuals to sensory deprivation by placing them in small, dark rooms for extended periods of time, completely cut off from the outside world. The idea was to see how the lack of sensory input would affect the mind and whether it would make individuals more susceptible to influence. The results were horrifying. The longer the subjects were isolated, the more they began to lose touch with reality, experiencing vivid hallucinations, delusions, and a profound sense of paranoia. But the CIA was undeterred. They believed they were on the brink of unlocking the secrets of the human mind, even if that meant sacrificing a few lives along the way. The agency's experiments grew more reckless as time went on. One such experiment involved the use of LSD on unsuspecting civilians in New York City. The CIA had arranged for a brothel to be set up as a front for their operations. Prostitutes working at the establishment were instructed to secretly dose their clients with LSD, while the CIA observed the effects through hidden cameras and microphones. The agency believed that by seeing how LSD affected people in a natural setting, they could better understand its potential for mind control. The consequences of these experiments were devastating. Many of the people dosed were left in a state of mental disarray, unable to make sense of what had happened to them. Some never recovered, suffering permanent psychological damage. And yet, the CIA pressed on, convinced that the potential rewards outweighed the costs. It wasn't just LSD that the CIA experimented with. They also explored other drugs, including mescaline, scopolamine, and barbiturates, hoping to find the ideal substance for breaking the human will. But in many cases, the results were far from what they had hoped. Far from creating the ultimate truth serum or mind control drug, the experiments often left the subjects mentally fractured with no clear answers as to how to control the human mind. Meanwhile, the CIA's reach expanded. MKUltra was no longer confined to a small group of researchers or military personnel. It became a large-scale operation with multiple sub-projects running in parallel. The agency worked with universities, private doctors, and research institutions, using them as fronts to conduct their experiments. The CIA even extended MKUltra's scope internationally, carrying out operations in foreign countries where they could operate with even less oversight. As the program continued, the victims of MKUltra began to speak out. Some survivors began to piece together their fragmented memories of the experiments they had been subjected to, realizing that they had been used as human guinea pigs. But it was not until much later, after MKUltra had already been officially shut down, that the full scale of the program's horrors began to emerge. The program's existence remained hidden for many years. The CIA had gone to great lengths to keep MKUltra a secret, using false identities and covert methods to cover their tracks. It wasn't until the 1970s, when Congress began to investigate the CIA's activities, that MKUltra was exposed to the public. But even then, much of the evidence was destroyed. Documents related to the program were shredded in an effort to protect the identities of those involved. Despite the cover-up, MKUltra's legacy is undeniable. The program left behind a trail of psychological trauma, broken lives, and ethical violations that have haunted the CIA and the U.S. government ever since. Today, MKUltra remains one of the darkest and most controversial chapters in the history of American intelligence operations. It serves as a chilling reminder of the lengths to which governments will go when the pursuit of power and control overrides the rights of the individual. Chapter 2: The CIA's Obsession with Mind Control. The Cold War was more than just a clash of political ideologies. It was a battle for the very control of the human mind. The Soviet Union's advances in psychological warfare, paired with growing fears of communist influence over the American public, sparked a sense of urgency in the United States government. The CIA, in particular, was obsessed with the idea that controlling the human mind could be the ultimate tool in espionage, manipulation, and even warfare. The roots of this obsession stretched back to the late 1940s and early 1950s, when the CIA first began experimenting with mind-altering substances as part of a covert project known as Operation Paperclip. Originally focused on bringing German scientists to the U.S. After World War II, Operation Paperclip led to a series of experiments on chemical agents that could potentially manipulate human behavior. The results of these early tests were mixed, but they set the stage for what would later become MKUltra. For the CIA, the central question was clear: could the human mind be controlled? The agency believed that if they could find a way to manipulate thoughts and behavior, they could turn the tide of global power in their favor. The ability to control or break the enemy without the need for conventional military force was the ultimate goal. Whether it was to extract information from prisoners, neutralize an adversary, or create covert agents without their knowledge, mind control became a top priority for American intelligence. In the early 1950s, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist and expert in biological warfare, was chosen to lead the program. His experience in the study of toxins and psychological manipulation made him the ideal candidate for the job. Gottlieb's involvement in MKUltra marked the beginning of an intense period of experimentation that would push the boundaries of science and ethics in ways never seen before. Gottlieb quickly became the chief architect of the CIA's mind control experiments, overseeing a vast network of operations designed to unlock the secrets of human behavior and susceptibility. While the U.S. government feared Soviet success with mind control, it also feared the potential of brainwashing. The idea that an individual could be turned against their own country or manipulated into doing something against their will became a haunting possibility. This was no longer just theoretical. It was believed that the enemy might already be using such tactics. In particular, the case of American POWs returning from the Korean War, many of whom had been brainwashed or coerced into making anti-American statements, triggered an urgent response within the CIA. The U.S. government feared that the Soviet Union could have developed methods to control individuals without them even knowing. In response, the CIA began investigating techniques that could achieve similar results. The program, which would later become MKUltra, was officially launched in 1953 under CIA Director Allen Dulles, who saw mind control as an essential aspect of national security. Dulles believed that in the era of nuclear weapons, information and psychological warfare could prove to be just as powerful as military force. Gottlieb and his team embarked on a series of experiments designed to manipulate consciousness. Their objective was to find a method for extracting information, neutralizing threats, and inducing behavior changes. The initial focus was on substances that could be used in covert operations. LSD was seen as the most promising candidate, and the CIA's interest in the drug grew quickly. LSD was still relatively unknown in the US, and the CIA had little understanding of its full effects on the human mind. But Gottlieb saw potential. If LSD could be used to break a person's resistance and alter their behavior, it could be the key to psychological dominance. The first experiments conducted under the MKUltra umbrella involved administering LSD to unsuspecting subjects, people who had no idea they were part of a secret government study. The targets included CIA agents, military personnel, and civilians. But the experiments didn't stop there. Gottlieb's team wanted to understand the true potential of LSD. How could it be used to manipulate, break, or control someone? Could it be used to turn individuals into unwitting agents of the U.S. government, or could it be used to force confessions and gain intelligence? The CIA's use of LSD as a tool of manipulation was groundbreaking, but it was also dangerous. The drug induced intense hallucinations, paranoia, and a profound disconnection from reality. For some, the effects were so severe that they experienced permanent psychological damage. But the CIA was undeterred. The agency continued to dose people without their consent, even experimenting with military personnel as a test group. The result was an environment of chaos and confusion as those subjected to the LSD doses were pushed to their mental limits. Some experiments involved giving military personnel LSD before sending them into high-stress combat situations to see how the drug impacted their ability to follow orders or think critically. Others were subjected to sensory deprivation, being placed in isolation for extended periods to see how their minds would react to extreme isolation and sensory input restriction. The ultimate goal was to find the perfect tool for psychological manipulation. The CIA believed that if they could break someone's mind, they could rebuild it using drugs, hypnosis, and other methods to create the ideal operative. But not all of the results were positive. The people subjected to these experiments were left with deep psychological scars. Some experienced psychosis, others were left in a state of extreme paranoia, unable to discern between reality and delusion. Yet, the CIA continued to press on, convinced that the power to manipulate the human mind was within their grasp. As the program expanded, it wasn't just about experimenting with drugs. The CIA's obsession grew to include other methods of mind control, including hypnosis, electroshock therapy, and psychological torture. These techniques were used to break the will of individuals and reprogram them to follow specific commands. The experimentation became more extreme, more invasive, and more dangerous. Those who had once been volunteers or unwilling participants now became victims of the CIA's reckless pursuit of psychological dominance. This obsession with mind control wasn't just a scientific endeavor. It was a desperate attempt to maintain national security in an era of uncertainty. But as the CIA delved deeper into the human psyche, they began to question how far they could push the boundaries of ethics in the name of security. And when the program expanded beyond their control, it would leave a trail of destruction and ruin. Chapter 3: LSD and the Gateway to Control. The human mind, for all its complexity and mystery, was seen by the CIA as a malleable entity, a tool that could be manipulated, bent to the will of those who understood its inner workings. At the center of their experiments was LSD, a powerful and unpredictable hallucinogenic substance. But why was LSD chosen as the drug of choice in the CIA's pursuit of mind control? What made it the centerpiece of a program that would leave behind a legacy of psychological trauma and ethical violations? LSD, or lysergic acid diethylamide, had been discovered in 1938 by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, but it wasn't until the early 1950s that it began to capture the attention of the CIA. The agency had heard rumors about the drug's potential for altering consciousness, and they quickly recognized its potential as a weapon in the psychological arsenal of espionage. The CIA's early experiments with LSD were driven by the belief that it could be the key to unlocking the human mind, rendering people more susceptible to suggestion and control. The initial goal of the CIA's experiments was simple: find a way to use LSD to extract information. In theory, the drug could act as a truth serum, making it impossible for an individual to resist revealing hidden secrets. But as the CIA began to administer LSD to its subjects, they quickly realized that the drug's effects were far more complex and unpredictable than they had anticipated. LSD is a powerful psychedelic drug that affects the brain's serotonin receptors, leading to altered perception, intense hallucinations, and a warped sense of reality. When taken in large doses, it can cause profound changes in thought patterns, emotions, and behavior. The CIA saw this as an opportunity to break down an individual's defenses, making them vulnerable to manipulation. If LSD could be used to create confusion and unravel a person's mental state, the agency believed they could influence their thoughts, behavior, and even force them to reveal classified information. But the first few experiments didn't go as planned. The CIA began testing LSD on its own agents, military personnel, and civilians, often without their consent or knowledge. The results were far more unpredictable than they had hoped. In some cases, subjects experienced intense hallucinations, leading to severe psychological distress. Some became paranoid, believing they were being watched or targeted by invisible forces. Others reported an overwhelming sense of disconnection from reality, unable to understand the world around them. Despite the unpredictable results, the CIA pressed forward. The agency began administering LSD to unwitting individuals, many of whom had no idea they were part of a secret government experiment. One of the first experiments involved dosing a CIA agent named Frank Olson, a biochemist who had been working with the agency on chemical warfare research. Olson was secretly dosed with LSD by his colleagues during a business retreat, and the effects were immediate. Olson became disoriented and paranoid, believing that he was being manipulated. Just a few days later, Olson fell to his death from a hotel window in New York City. While the CIA initially claimed his death was a suicide, evidence later suggested that his deteriorating mental state caused by the LSD dose may have played a role in his tragic death. Olson's death was just one of many that would come to light in the aftermath of MKUltra. The true effects of LSD on those who were exposed to it were horrifying. Many suffered long-term psychological damage, some never recovering from the trauma. And yet, the CIA continued its experiments, convinced that the drug held the key to achieving mind control. To the agency, the human cost was secondary to the ultimate goal of gaining an edge over the Soviets. The CIA's experiments were not limited to civilians or agents. They also extended to military personnel. In one experiment, the military special forces were dosed with LSD and sent into combat-like situations to observe their reactions. The hope was that the drug could help them operate under extreme pressure, or that it might allow them to carry out covert missions without fully realizing the extent of their actions. But the results were disastrous. Soldiers who were dosed with LSD became increasingly paranoid and unable to function properly. Some soldiers even began to question their loyalty, believing they had been brainwashed or manipulated by their superiors. Despite the failure of these early experiments, the CIA continued to expand its research. The agency sought new ways to refine the use of LSD and harness its power. They explored other methods of combining LSD with hypnosis, mind control techniques, and sensory deprivation to create a powerful tool for psychological manipulation. The experiments grew more extreme, and the ethical boundaries were pushed even further. As LSD was administered to more and more subjects, the consequences became more severe. But the CIA was not deterred. They believed they had found the key to a new kind of warfare, one that didn't rely on guns or bombs, but on control over the human mind. The promise of this psychedelic weapon seemed endless. They hoped it could be used not just for interrogation, but to break and reprogram individuals. The goal wasn't just to force someone to reveal secrets. It was to create a person who would act on command, without questioning authority. In their pursuit of the perfect mind control tool, the CIA didn't just experiment on volunteers or soldiers. The agency began secretly dosing ordinary civilians without their knowledge or consent. These civilians were often selected at random, plucked from the streets, or approached under false pretenses. In some cases, they were promised medical treatment only to find themselves subjects of a government experiment. One of the most notorious experiments took place in New York City, where the CIA secretly dosed individuals at a brothel. The idea was to observe how LSD affected people in a more natural, everyday setting. The prostitutes working at the establishment were instructed to dose their clients with LSD, while the CIA observed the effects through hidden cameras. The results were chilling. Many of the unsuspecting victims were left in a state of confusion, paranoia, and psychological distress. Despite the ethical violations, the CIA pressed on, continuing to dose more and more subjects with LSD in order to gain a deeper understanding of how the drug affected the human mind. But as the experiments grew more extreme, so did the toll it took on the subjects. Some victims were left with permanent psychological scars, unable to make sense of what had happened to them. Others lost their grip on reality entirely, becoming lost in a world of delusion and confusion. But the CIA's desire to control the human mind didn't stop with LSD. As the program expanded, it grew more twisted. The agency delved into hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and other psychological manipulation techniques. They sought to find the perfect formula for mind control, one that could break even the most resistant individuals. At the core of it all was the belief that if they could control the mind, they could control the world. And for the CIA, the possibility of controlling an individual's thoughts, actions, and behavior seemed like a path to ultimate power. But as MKUltra continued to unfold, the line between scientific exploration and ethical violation blurred further. The individuals subjected to the CIA's experiments were left with broken minds, and the agency's secrecy prevented the public from ever learning the full extent of the horrors that had taken place. The story of MKUltra would not be fully revealed until much later, when the survivors, the victims, and whistleblowers began to piece together the dark truth. Chapter 4: The Victims of MKUltra. The chilling reality of MKUltra lies not just in the secrecy with which it was conducted, but in the human cost of its experiments. Behind the curtain of government secrecy, thousands of individuals were subjected to disturbing psychological experiments, with many unknowingly made victims of a covert operation that would leave lasting scars on their lives. These victims were not just a byproduct of a program gone wrong, they were the very reason for the program's existence, pawns in a high-stakes game of psychological warfare. At the heart of MKUltra was a disregard for ethical boundaries, where the ends were seen to justify the means. And what were those means? Psychological manipulation and chemical manipulation, most notably through the use of LSD and other mind-altering substances. But the true extent of the damage done to these individuals would remain largely hidden for decades. The unwitting participants. Perhaps the most horrifying aspect of MKUltra was that many of its victims had no idea they were part of an experiment. The CIA dosed unwitting civilians, military personnel, and even government employees without their consent. The victims were often people who were in vulnerable positions, people who were never informed of the risks or what was happening to them. One of the first and most notorious groups of victims were CIA agents themselves. These were men and women who worked for the agency, trusted by their country to safeguard its secrets. Yet, they too were subjected to experimentation, with the CIA secretly dosing them with LSD, often without their knowledge. The agency believed that by observing the effects of LSD on their own agents, they could better understand how it might affect others in covert operations. Some agents were told they were simply participating in a study of new medical treatments. Others had no idea at all. The result was a terrifying loss of control as their mental state deteriorated and they were thrust into a state of confusion and paranoia. But it wasn't just CIA agents who were targeted. Soldiers were also subjected to LSD doses, with the military believing that it might somehow help them handle the intense stress of combat. The tests were done in a controlled setting, but the psychological results were often devastating. Soldiers experienced feelings of disorientation, extreme paranoia, and hallucinations, and many were left with long-term psychological trauma. In one experiment, soldiers were dosed with LSD before being placed in simulated combat situations. The hope was that the drug would help them manage the extreme stress of battle, but the reality was that it only made them more vulnerable to the psychological strain of war. The experiments led to mental breakdowns, leaving many soldiers scarred for life. However, the worst victims of MKUltra were perhaps the ordinary civilians, who were chosen at random to be part of the experiments. They were often unwitting participants who were dosed without any explanation, their lives forever altered by a program they never signed up for. Some were simply randomly selected by doctors or scientists working under the auspices of MKUltra. Others were selected because they were in situations where they were most vulnerable: patients in mental institutions, prisoners, or those suffering from addiction. These individuals had no way of knowing that they were part of an experiment being run by the CIA. And even if they did, they had no legal or social recourse. They were often treated as disposable, mere subjects of an experiment with no consideration for their well-being. One of the most devastating aspects of MKUltra's experimentation on civilians was that many were completely unaware they were being manipulated. Some of the subjects were told they were being treated for medical conditions when, in fact, they were being dosed with LSD. Others were involved in clinical trials under false pretenses, believing they were participating in medical research designed to improve their health or mental well-being. These individuals, many of whom were already struggling with their own mental health issues, were subjected to high doses of LSD, which pushed them to the brink of insanity. The effects, psychological damage, and long-term consequences. The long-term psychological effects on MKUltra's victims were devastating. The trauma caused by these experiments wasn't just temporary. Many victims were left with lifelong psychological scars. For some, the experiments caused extreme paranoia, leaving them unable to trust their own thoughts or feelings. Others found themselves unable to cope with the hallucinations and disorientation they experienced during and after the dosing. One of the most tragic consequences was the permanent damage that some victims suffered as a result of the experiments. Some individuals, having been dosed repeatedly with LSD, were left in a state of mental disarray, unable to function in daily life, unable to form normal relationships, and in some cases, unable to even recognize their own identities. Many of these victims were unable to hold down jobs or continue their regular lives, while others found themselves committed to psychiatric institutions for the rest of their lives. Perhaps the most notorious victims were those who were subjected to Dr. Ewan Cameron's experiments in Canada. Dr. Cameron was a psychiatrist working with the CIA to study methods of mind control. His experiments in sensory deprivation and psychic driving, a form of forced memory reprogramming, took place at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. Cameron's methods involved using LSD in combination with sensory deprivation and electroshock therapy. His goal was to erase the minds of his patients and then rebuild them with new, correct beliefs. Many of the patients he experimented on suffered long-term mental damage. They were left with fragmented memories, disjointed realities, and an inability to distinguish what had happened to them. The trauma caused by Cameron's experiments was so severe that some victims would never recover, their lives completely altered by the CIA's twisted experiments. Covering up the damage. The true extent of MKUltra's damage was never fully realized at the time. The CIA went to great lengths to cover up its experiments. Many of the documents and records relating to MKUltra were destroyed, leaving behind little to no paper trail. Those involved in the program, including the victims, were told to keep quiet, under the threat of losing their jobs, their reputations, and even their freedom. For decades, the victims of MKUltra had no voice. They were left in the dark, unaware of the true nature of the experiments they had been subjected to. Many of them, having lost their grip on reality, were unable to make sense of what had happened to them. But as the years passed, a few brave souls began to speak out, telling their stories of being used as guinea pigs by the government. In 1975, after public pressure and growing public concern over government experimentation, Congress launched an investigation into MKUltra. The Church Committee hearings, led by Senator Frank Church, helped uncover the truth about the CIA's experiments. But by then, the damage had already been done. The victims who had survived were left with broken lives, while the CIA had successfully covered up much of the program's existence. The stories of the victims, however, could not be erased. Some went on to file lawsuits against the government, hoping to gain some measure of justice for the horrors they had experienced. But the scars of MKUltra remain. Many of the victims of these experiments are still living with the psychological trauma today. Chapter 5: The expansion of MKUltra from LSD to extreme methods. By the mid-1950s, MKUltra was no longer a small-scale experimental program confined to a few isolated tests. What started as a project with the primary aim of testing LSD's ability to manipulate the human mind grew into an all-encompassing pursuit of psychological control. As the CIA faced increasing pressure to show results, the program expanded to explore other drugs, torture techniques, and sophisticated psychological methods, all in the pursuit of a secret weapon, complete and utter mind control. The CIA's pursuit of mind control did not stop at LSD. In fact, the agency soon realized that LSD alone could not achieve the level of psychological manipulation they were looking for. While LSD had its advantages as an experimental tool, it was also deeply unpredictable, with the potential to cause lasting damage to subjects. To overcome these limitations, the CIA began experimenting with a wider variety of psychotropic drugs. The agency's interest in these drugs extended far beyond just LSD. More and more substances were tested, including mescaline, scopolamine, barbiturates, and ecstasy, all in an effort to push the boundaries of mind manipulation. At the same time, the agency began focusing more heavily on hypnosis, electroshock therapy, and sensory deprivation, methods that had been proven to break down an individual's mental defenses. The CIA was determined to develop a program that could break anyone, enemy agents, spies, and even ordinary citizens, so thoroughly that they would become pawns, unable to resist the agency's will. The more extreme the techniques, the more confident the agency became that they were on the cusp of unlocking the ultimate tool of psychological warfare. The role of hypnosis, turning subjects into puppets. Hypnosis became a key component of MKUltra. The CIA believed that if a person could be hypnotized, their thoughts and actions could be manipulated or even reprogrammed to serve a covert purpose. The agency's aim was to create hypnotic subjects, individuals who could be controlled without their knowledge or consent. The CIA brought in psychologists and hypnotists, including individuals like Dr. Milton Erickson, who was known for his groundbreaking work in hypnotherapy. These experts were tasked with exploring the possibility of using hypnosis in combination with LSD and other drugs to manipulate a subject's behavior. Hypnosis, when combined with mind-altering substances, had the potential to create a complete breakdown in mental defenses, making a person susceptible to suggestion. One infamous experiment involved the CIA's attempt to create a Manchurian candidate, an individual who would perform an action, such as assassinating a political figure, without any recollection or knowledge of the act. These subjects would be subjected to intense hypnotic sessions, followed by drug-induced amnesia. The agency hoped this technique would create a kind of sleeper agent, a person who could be activated at will, carrying out instructions without ever knowing they had been manipulated. The goal was to see if a person could be controlled through a combination of psychological techniques and mind-altering substances, thus making them the perfect covert operative. However, the results were far from perfect. The CIA found that while hypnosis had some success in altering behavior, the combination with LSD often created a volatile and unpredictable reaction. Individuals subjected to these experiments often lost their sense of reality, and the long-term psychological damage was devastating. Subjects frequently reported experiencing memory loss, disorientation, and hallucinations that would not go away even long after the experiments had ended. Electroshock therapy, a tool for reprogramming the mind. As the CIA delved deeper into mind control, they began to adopt electroshock therapy as one of their primary techniques. Electroshock therapy, which had been used in psychiatric hospitals for decades, was now being tested by the CIA to break down an individual's mental defenses. The agency believed that the severe trauma caused by electroshock could lead to a reprogramming of the mind, essentially wiping the slate clean and allowing for the insertion of new thoughts or behavior patterns. At times, electroshock therapy was used in combination with LSD. Subjects were administered LSD to break down their sense of reality, followed by electroshock therapy, which was intended to shock them into a blank mental state. The combination was seen as a way to reset the brain, making it more malleable for further programming. But this process was far from controlled or humane. The psychological trauma inflicted on the victims was severe and long-lasting, and in many cases, subjects were left with irreparable brain damage. In some of the worst experiments, the CIA used unwitting subjects, including patients in psychiatric hospitals, for electroshock tests. These individuals had no idea they were part of a covert government operation. Instead, they were told they were receiving treatment for mental illnesses. The patients were subjected to repeated sessions of electroshock therapy, often without any clear medical justification. The damage caused by these treatments was not just physical, it was psychological, leaving many individuals with crippling mental health issues that would plague them for the rest of their lives. Sensory deprivation, the breaking of the mind. Another technique the CIA experimented with was sensory deprivation, which involved isolating subjects in rooms devoid of any sensory input. The CIA believed that prolonged isolation would break down the mental faculties, making it easier to manipulate the individual's thoughts and behavior. The experiments were often extreme. Subjects were placed in bare rooms with no light, sound, or tactile stimulation. The goal was to deprive the subject of sensory input for as long as possible in order to trigger a psychological collapse. Some individuals were isolated in small, dark rooms for days or even weeks, forced to confront the disorienting effects of isolation. The CIA hoped that this would make the subject more susceptible to suggestion, essentially reducing them to a state of mental collapse. But the results were far from what the CIA had hoped for. While some subjects did indeed break down mentally, others became increasingly paranoid and delusional. The psychological damage caused by sensory deprivation was severe, leaving many victims with lasting psychoses. The human mind is not built to endure such extreme isolation. The effects were unpredictable, and the toll it took on subjects was devastating. For some, the disorientation caused by sensory deprivation was so severe that they never fully recovered. They were left with deep psychological scars, unable to trust their own perceptions of reality. The expansion into universities and hospitals. As the CIA's MKUltra program grew, the agency sought new ways to expand its operations. They reached out to universities, research institutions, and hospitals, often working with medical professionals who were either unaware or complicit in the experiments. Dr. Ewan Cameron, a psychiatrist working at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, became one of the most notorious figures involved in MKUltra. Cameron's experiments were especially cruel. He subjected patients to a combination of LSD, sensory deprivation, and electroshock therapy, all in an effort to reprogram their minds. His experiments were deemed so unethical that they led to permanent psychological damage for many of his patients. Some of them lost the ability to remember their past, while others were left with lifelong mental disorders. The CIA's reach extended to hospitals and research centers across the United States and abroad. These institutions were often willing to cooperate with the CIA's funding in exchange for grants or research opportunities. The agency used these connections to conduct secret experiments on vulnerable populations, including psychiatric patients, prisoners, and even soldiers, all under the guise of legitimate medical research. Chapter 6: The Whistleblowers and Cover-Ups. As the scope of MKUltra expanded throughout the 1950s and 1960s, so did the efforts to conceal the truth. The CIA, operating in the dark corners of government secrecy, meticulously worked to cover up its illicit activities. The program, which was conducted without oversight, ran unchecked for years, leaving behind a trail of victims whose lives were irrevocably damaged. The government, bent on maintaining its clandestine operations, took extreme measures to suppress any evidence that might expose the true nature of MKUltra. But as time went on, cracks began to form in the CIA's airtight system of secrecy. There were whispers, rumors that couldn't be ignored. Former participants, victims, and even insiders from within the program itself began to speak out. The truth of MKUltra, a story buried under mountains of classified files, was slowly beginning to surface. And in the early 1970s, the first cracks in the CIA's cover-up began to break open, heralding a new chapter of discovery. The first whistleblower, the death of Frank Olson. The first major public exposure of MKUltra began with the mysterious death of Frank Olson, a CIA biochemist working with the Agency on Chemical Warfare Research. In 1953, Olson was secretly dosed with LSD by his colleagues during a work retreat, an experiment designed to observe the effects of the drug. While the CIA initially claimed Olson's death was a suicide, many of his friends and family members suspected foul play. Olson had been deeply disturbed after the LSD dosing, exhibiting signs of severe paranoia and psychosis. Just a few days later, he fell to his death from the window of a New York hotel, under circumstances that raised suspicions about whether he had jumped or had been thrown. For years, the CIA maintained that Olson's death was a tragic incident, but in the late 1970s, his family pressed for answers. In a shocking turn, the U.S. government admitted that Olson had indeed been dosed with LSD without his knowledge, and his mental breakdown was a direct result of the experiment. The revelation of Olson's death and the CIA's involvement marked the first step toward the public exposure of MKUltra. But Olson's death was just the beginning. As journalists and investigators dug deeper into his case, they began to uncover a much larger, hidden operation. Olson's family, in their pursuit of justice, filed a lawsuit against the government, which eventually led to a settlement and a public apology from the U.S. government. But what Olson's family could not have known at the time was that his death would serve as the spark that ignited a firestorm of revelations about MKUltra's activities. The Church Committee and congressional investigations. The death of Frank Olson was the catalyst that led to the Church Committee, a Senate investigation into the CIA and other intelligence agencies' practices. In 1975, after increasing public pressure and growing concerns over government secrecy, Senator Frank Church of Idaho led a congressional investigation into the CIA's illegal activities. The committee, formerly known as the Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with Respect to Intelligence Activities, began to probe the CIA's involvement in MKUltra among other covert operations. The Church Committee's investigation, which included hearings and testimony from whistleblowers, led to shocking revelations about the extent of MKUltra. Over the course of the investigation, the CIA was forced to admit that they had conducted extensive, illegal mind control experiments on both U.S. citizens and foreign nationals, and that they had spied on and manipulated their own government personnel. The committee uncovered a mountain of evidence of unethical practices, including experiments on individuals without their knowledge or consent, drugging innocent civilians, and repeated violations of human rights. In 1975, the Church Committee released a report which exposed the magnitude of MKUltra and its effects on both the victims and the U.S. government. Despite the committee's findings, many of the CIA's records were sealed, and large portions of the investigation were redacted or destroyed, including many MKUltra files that had been deemed too sensitive to release to the public. Even as the investigation unfolded, there were those who continued to cover up or downplay the extent of MKUltra's operations. Many high-ranking government officials continued to insist that the program was a necessary evil in the fight against communism, while others worked behind closed doors to prevent the full truth from being revealed. The battle for transparency, justice, and accountability would stretch on for years. The role of survivors and whistleblowers. While government investigations were making slow progress, a number of survivors of MKUltra's experiments began to speak out. These brave whistleblowers, many of whom had been subjected to brutal experiments, began to sue the government, hoping to receive compensation for the psychological damage they had endured. Some survivors sought legal recourse, but the long road to justice was fraught with obstacles, including government resistance and an ongoing campaign to discredit those who dared to tell the truth. One of the most prominent figures in exposing MKUltra was John Marks, a former journalist and investigator who dedicated his life to uncovering the secrets of the program. In 1979, Marks published The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, a book that revealed the full extent of MKUltra's experiments. Marks' work was instrumental in uncovering the CIA's darkest secrets and in revealing the devastating effects of the program on those who were subjected to it. His book, based on years of research and interviews with survivors, became a crucial resource for understanding the full scope of MKUltra. As more survivors and whistleblowers came forward, the true extent of the damage caused by MKUltra became clear. One of the most haunting accounts came from a woman named Kathy, a pseudonym used to protect her identity, who had been a patient at a psychiatric hospital in the 1950s. She described how she was secretly dosed with LSD and subjected to electroshock therapy as part of a CIA-sponsored experiment. Her testimony, along with that of other victims, helped bring attention to the widespread human rights abuses that MKUltra had facilitated. The whistleblowers who came forward often faced personal risks. Many were ostracized, disbelieved, or silenced in various ways, but they persisted in telling their stories, despite the danger. Their bravery shone a light on the dark legacy of MKUltra, and their efforts to uncover the truth would become part of the broader movement for government transparency and accountability. The legacy of the cover-up. While the revelations about MKUltra were groundbreaking, the full scope of the program's impact remained hidden for decades. The CIA's cover-up had been meticulous, and even after the Church Committee's investigation, many files were destroyed, and key documents were classified or sealed for national security reasons. The lack of public accountability allowed the CIA to escape without facing the full consequences of their actions. In the years that followed, the public became increasingly aware of the human cost of MKUltra. Victims and survivors of the experiments came together to share their stories, slowly but surely forcing the government to recognize the profound damage done. In some cases, the victims were awarded small settlements or compensation for their suffering, but justice was elusive. The pain and trauma that MKUltra inflicted on its victims couldn't be undone by money or public apologies. Today, MKUltra remains one of the darkest chapters in U.S. history. The cover-ups and attempts to silence whistleblowers only serve to underscore the depths of the program's deceit. Yet, thanks to the efforts of survivors, journalists, and activists, the truth of MKUltra is now known, and the program is a stark reminder of the government's potential to violate the rights of its citizens in the name of national security. Chapter 7: The Destruction of Evidence and the Shredding of Truth. As the revelations of MKUltra slowly started to surface, the CIA did what it had always done best: cover its tracks. The organization, known for its expertise in secrecy, understood that the truth about MKUltra, if exposed fully, could shake the very foundations of the U.S. government. But as investigations began to dig deeper into the murky world of mind control experiments, the CIA's response was swift, calculated, and ultimately damning. Rather than confronting the scale of the damage, the agency chose a more insidious path: destroy the evidence. In 1973, just as the Church Committee hearings were starting to uncover the horrific details of MKUltra, Richard Helms, then CIA director, made a decision that would prevent much of the public from ever knowing the full extent of the program's atrocities. Helms ordered that all files related to MKUltra be destroyed. These files contained irreplaceable records of experiments, subjects, and operations that had been carefully documented over the years. The destruction of these records was not a random act. It was a calculated move to erase the CIA's involvement in the program from history. Helms' decision to destroy the MKUltra files was not an isolated case. In fact, it was part of a broader pattern of secrecy and damage control that had persisted throughout the program. The CIA had already been operating in the shadows for years, and now, with mounting pressure from journalists, survivors, and congressional investigations, the agency made a final, desperate attempt to bury the truth. Helms justified the destruction of the files by claiming that it was necessary for national security. The CIA's standard excuse for its covert activities, protecting the country, was trotted out once more to explain why certain documents had to be permanently erased. This act of destruction did not come without consequence. While the shredding of files effectively erased much of the historical record of MKUltra, it did not erase the lasting damage done to the victims. Nor did it eliminate the traces of MKUltra that were slowly emerging through other means. The program's survivors, having been subjected to unimaginable psychological and physical harm, were left without the solid proof they needed to seek justice. But the destruction of these files was not the final blow to MKUltra. It would come back to haunt the CIA in the coming years. The fragments of the past, what was left behind. Although the CIA took great pains to destroy its records, not all was lost. The shredding of MKUltra files did not erase the testimonies of the victims, the public records of the Church Committee hearings, or the evidence that had already been uncovered by brave whistleblowers. Some records had been moved out of the CIA's direct control, including documents that were discovered after the shredding order. The survival of a few files and testimonies allowed the public to begin to understand the scale of the CIA's transgressions. Additionally, the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, allowed journalists and investigative researchers to access certain government documents, though many were still heavily redacted. Despite the efforts to suppress the program's details, some important files were eventually uncovered in 1980 when a library archive received a batch of declassified CIA documents. While not a complete recovery of the MKUltra records, these documents provided more insight into the scope of the CIA's experiments, allowing for the partial reconstruction of MKUltra's activities. But even with these documents in hand, the full extent of MKUltra's reach remains unclear. Much of the material had been deliberately wiped away, leaving behind only fragments of a program designed to erase the very minds it sought to control. The push for accountability, lawsuits, and legal battles. As the years went on, the survivors of MKUltra began their own fight for justice. Many of them had lived in silence, unsure of what had happened to them or why they had been chosen as guinea pigs. After the Church Committee's report in 1975, which brought MKUltra to public attention, many victims began to piece together the horrifying reality of what had happened to them. Some survivors had vague memories of being dosed with LSD or subjected to extreme psychological manipulation, but many were left with a sense of mental fragmentation. They simply couldn't remember everything. Legal battles soon erupted. Victims of MKUltra sought justice, filing lawsuits against the CIA, the U.S. government, and the agencies that had been involved in their suffering. Former patients of Dr. Ewan Cameron's experiments in Canada, for example, filed a class action lawsuit in the 1980s, demanding compensation for the psychological damage they had endured. These lawsuits were challenging as much of the evidence had been destroyed and the government was unwilling to publicly acknowledge the scale of MKUltra's wrongdoing. Some legal efforts were successful, with the U.S. government agreeing to settle cases with the victims. In 1988, the government awarded $750,000 to a group of surviving victims as part of a settlement related to the LSD experimentation. While this settlement provided some compensation, it was hardly enough to address the irreparable damage done to those subjected to MKUltra's mind control tactics. But even with financial settlements, the victims faced an even bigger challenge: finding justice. The CIA had successfully kept its program hidden for years, and many of the individuals responsible for the horrific experiments were never held accountable. The lack of accountability in MKUltra's aftermath led many to wonder whether the program's true legacy would be buried forever. The long road to public recognition. The CIA's destruction of evidence did not prevent journalists and activists from continuing their quest to uncover the full truth about MKUltra. The work of individuals like John Marks, whose book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, became one of the first comprehensive accounts of the program, helped keep the story alive. Marks, along with others, pieced together the fragments of MKUltra's history using surviving documents, interviews with former agents, and testimonies from victims. However, the journey for public recognition of the full scope of MKUltra's damage would take decades. The U.S. government, while forced to acknowledge the program's existence, continued to downplay its impact. The CIA's reluctance to fully cooperate with investigators and its reluctance to release all the documents meant that many questions remained unanswered for years. For the victims, justice remained a distant goal. The battle for recognition continued into the 1990s and 2000s, as more victims came forward to share their stories. Slowly but surely, the public began to understand the true cost of MKUltra. Survivors' accounts, coupled with declassified documents and the ongoing investigations into the CIA's dark past, ensured that MKUltra would never be forgotten. The unanswered questions. Despite the efforts of survivors, journalists, and legal advocates, many questions about MKUltra remain unanswered. The destroyed documents, along with the continued refusal of the CIA to fully cooperate with investigations, mean that the full scope of the program may never be revealed. What else did the CIA discover during its experiments? How many more victims were there? How many were permanently scarred by the abuse they endured? What we do know is that MKUltra represented one of the darkest moments in U.S. history, where the government's thirst for control led it to violate the very principles it was meant to uphold. The destruction of evidence, the efforts to cover up the program, and the reluctance to hold those responsible accountable all served to protect the CIA's interests while leaving the victims to suffer in silence for years. Chapter 8: The Legacy of MKUltra, Psychological Impact and Long-Term Consequences. MKUltra was not just a government experiment gone awry, it was a program that wreaked havoc on the psychological well-being of its victims, leaving a trail of lifelong trauma and confusion in its wake. The true impact of MKUltra's experiments on the individuals subjected to its manipulations went far beyond the immediate aftermath. It rippled through the lives of many, often leaving them broken, their minds fractured by the very techniques the CIA had hoped to master. As survivors came forward, it became clear that the legacy of MKUltra was not only the physical damage inflicted by the experiments, but the deep psychological scars that would remain for a lifetime. Psychological trauma. The unseen scars. For many of the victims, MKUltra's experiments were not just isolated incidents. They were life-altering events that shattered their sense of reality. The CIA's mind control experiments, which included repeated doses of LSD, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and electroshock therapy, had profound psychological effects on those who were subjected to them. While the CIA saw its victims as tools to be manipulated and discarded, the long-term trauma they experienced was anything but temporary. One of the most enduring effects of MKUltra on its victims was memory loss and fragmented memories. Many survivors struggled to make sense of the blackouts and lapses in their recollection of events. Those who were dosed with LSD often experienced profound disorientation and confusion during and after the experiment. Some victims would later come to realize they had been used as part of a government experiment, but the hazy recollections and trauma made it difficult for them to piece together the truth. For some, their memories of the events remained so fragmented that they would question whether the experiences were real or just the product of their distorted minds. One woman, a survivor of Dr. Ewan Cameron's experiments, described how she was subjected to repeated doses of LSD combined with electroshock therapy and sensory deprivation, all in the name of reprogramming her mind. She recalled the hallucinations, the loss of reality, and the constant sense of fear that followed her long after the experiments had ended. The trauma left her unable to trust her own memories, unsure of what had happened to her and what had been artificially implanted. Her identity, once whole, was now fractured beyond recognition. For many, the psychological impact was so severe that they struggled to function in daily life. The paranoia, anxiety, and depression that followed the experiments left them emotionally crippled. Some victims became addicted to substances in an attempt to numb the pain, while others sought refuge in psychiatric care, unable to cope with the overwhelming emotions triggered by their memories. The psychological toll of MKUltra was nothing short of devastating, and it didn't end with the experiments. The psychological effects followed the victims throughout their lives, leaving them haunted by the specter of a past they could not fully understand. The destruction of trust. One of the most insidious consequences of MKUltra was the destruction of trust. The victims of the program were often people who had put their faith in institutions, whether it was the military, medical professionals, or even the government itself. The CIA, an institution designed to protect the country, had instead betrayed its citizens, exploiting their vulnerability for the sake of national security. The survivors were left with a deep sense of mistrust and paranoia. Many came to see the government as an entity that would do anything, including destroying lives, to achieve its objectives. The program shattered the relationship between the government and its citizens, as the public realized that even those who had taken an oath to serve and protect the country were willing to sacrifice their fellow citizens in the name of security. For some victims, the emotional wounds were so deep that they became disillusioned with society itself. Their experiences with MKUltra destroyed any faith they had in the idea of institutional protection. If the government could turn its own citizens into guinea pigs, what else was it capable of? The erosion of trust in authority figures, whether doctors, scientists, or government officials, has had long-lasting consequences for the victims who were forced to live with the consequences of a betrayal that is difficult to fully articulate. The fight for justice. Legal and personal struggles. Despite the decades of secrecy, MKUltra's victims eventually began to find a voice. In the 1970s and 1980s, after the program had been exposed to the public through the Church Committee investigations, survivors started seeking legal action. They filed lawsuits against the U.S., government demanding compensation for the harm they had suffered. But the process was anything but easy. The CIA's stonewalling continued, and survivors faced significant obstacles in trying to prove their claims. For many, the hardest part was simply finding evidence that could support their case. Most of the documents that could have proved the extent of the CIA's wrongdoing had been shredded or destroyed. The government's refusal to release certain documents, many of which were classified under the guise of national security, meant that many survivors had to fight an uphill battle for justice. Some legal battles were won, and the U.S. government settled with a few victims, offering financial compensation for the psychological and physical harm they had suffered. However, these settlements were often insufficient given the lifelong consequences of the CIA's experiments. The survivors of MKUltra didn't just need money, they needed a sense of closure and acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done to them. Many continued to fight for recognition and accountability for the CIA's actions even as they dealt with the profound emotional and psychological scars of their experiences. One of the most tragic elements of the fight for justice was that many victims died before receiving recognition or compensation. The lasting trauma they experienced, coupled with the mental health issues resulting from MKUltra, meant that some did not live long enough to see the full scope of the program exposed. Even as survivors continued to press for justice, the pain of their experiences could never truly be healed. The moral and ethical reckoning. MKUltra forced the world to confront some uncomfortable truths about the limits of scientific experimentation and the role of government in protecting the rights of individuals. The program's existence and its sheer disregard for human dignity raised fundamental questions about the ethics of experimentation. Should the pursuit of knowledge ever come at the expense of human life? How far is too far when it comes to testing the limits of the mind? These are questions that continue to resonate today, as the legacy of MKUltra remains a potent reminder of the dangers of unchecked governmental power. The moral reckoning of MKUltra also forced the scientific community to re-examine the ethics of research. While some of the people involved in MKUltra's experimentation were recognized as legitimate scientists and psychiatrists, their involvement in such a morally bankrupt program tarnished the reputation of medical research for years to come. The ethical violations committed under MKUltra have since become a defining example of how the scientific community can be misused for political or military purposes. Even today, the shadow of MKUltra lingers in the public imagination. The program remains a symbol of the dangers of secrecy and the potential for exploitation that exists when government agencies operate without accountability. For the victims, MKUltra was a deeply personal trauma, but it also served as a warning to the world about the lengths to which governments can go when they believe they are justified in violating human rights. A lasting legacy. MKUltra left behind a legacy that goes beyond the victims and their fight for justice. The program remains a cautionary tale, a reminder of how far governments will go to maintain power and control. The ethical violations, psychological trauma, and destruction of trust that MKUltra caused continue to resonate today. The program is a painful reminder of how human rights can be easily ignored when political and military goals take precedence. As the years pass, the survivors of MKUltra continue to grapple with the lasting effects of the program on their lives. For some, the psychological scars will never heal. For others, the pursuit of justice and the acknowledgement of the wrongs done to them is a lifelong battle. Yet, their stories ensure that the world will never forget the cost of MKUltra and the lasting impact it had on those it sought to control. Chapter 9. The ongoing fight for accountability. Though MKUltra was officially shut down in the early 1960s, the repercussions of the program reverberated for decades. Survivors, whistleblowers, and advocates for transparency worked tirelessly, but the road to accountability was long, fraught with resistance, and ultimately incomplete. The CIA's efforts to conceal the full scope of the program created a labyrinthine web of secrecy and denial, making it nearly impossible for those affected to seek justice in the years that followed. But the victims of MKUltra were not easily silenced, and their courage in speaking out would become the driving force in the ongoing battle for justice and recognition. The initial denial and the attempt to move on. For many years, the U.S. government and the CIA worked to bury the horrors of MKUltra. Even after the Church Committee hearings in 1975 began to expose the program, those in power continued to deflect, downplay, or outright deny the full extent of MKUltra's reach. Although some government documents had been released under the Freedom of Information Act, many key records were still hidden under the blanket of national security concerns. Worse, much of the evidence that could have illuminated the program's darkest corners had been destroyed. The CIA's claim was simple: MKUltra was an experiment gone wrong, a misguided attempt at securing national security in the midst of Cold War paranoia. Once the program had been exposed, they expressed regret, but ultimately the agency's actions went largely unpunished. No one within the CIA was held responsible for the extensive damage done to the lives of the individuals they had used as subjects. No one was charged with the crimes committed during MKUltra, and in the years that followed, the public and governmental response was one of evasion, offering condolences, but no real consequences for those who had orchestrated the abuses. For the victims, this was the beginning of a long and frustrating battle for justice. Many had suffered not just from the immediate physical and psychological consequences of MKUltra's experiments, but from the deep sense of betrayal by the very institutions they had trusted. The long silence from the U.S. government, combined with the lack of accountability, left many survivors feeling abandoned by the country they had once believed in. The silence of the institutions. Despite the official investigations, there was no real effort to hold the perpetrators accountable. The CIA's high-ranking officials involved in MKUltra, including Sidney Gottlieb and Richard Helms, were never subjected to criminal charges, and no formal apology or restitution was offered to the victims of the program. The government, in fact, went to great lengths to avoid any further public scrutiny of its activities. Public hearings were limited, and key evidence was kept sealed. While some investigations made strides in bringing the program to light, the U.S. government failed to offer its full support to the people who had suffered at the hands of MKUltra. The survivors, many of whom had faced permanent psychological trauma, were left without closure. For them, the lack of accountability was a second betrayal. They were forced to endure the painful aftermath of the program, left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, while those who had been responsible for the program continued their careers largely undisturbed. Some CIA officials even went on to hold prominent positions in other branches of government without facing public censure or criminal charges for the atrocities committed under MKUltra. The victims' struggle for recognition. The survivors of MKUltra refused to be silenced. While the government did little to help them, they found strength in one another and began to speak out. These brave survivors sought recognition, accountability, and compensation for the harm they had endured. Many began to organize, turning their personal pain into activism, hoping to bring attention to their plight and ensure that the world would know the full extent of the damage done. Legal battles were the primary route for victims to seek justice. They began filing lawsuits against the U.S. government, the CIA, and those responsible for conducting the experiments. However, these lawsuits were often met with resistance, and legal challenges took years, even decades, to navigate. As survivors sought compensation for the years of suffering they had endured, they faced a government that continued to fight back. Despite the lack of evidence due to the CIA's destruction of documents, survivors tried to piece together their own accounts using the available records, testimonies, and whatever evidence could be gathered to support their claims. Some legal battles were successful. In 1988, a group of victims was awarded a settlement for their involvement in the LSD experiments. The total settlement reached $750,000, but it was hardly enough to compensate for the emotional and psychological damage done by MKUltra. This settlement did not address the broader damage caused by the program, and it failed to provide any real public acknowledgement of the full scale of the CIA's operations. However, many victims and their families never received a penny. In some cases, the government outright rejected claims or dismissed them as part of conspiracy theories, refusing to accept responsibility for the experiments or the suffering caused. The legal route, though valuable, was only a small part of the larger struggle for recognition, as the government continued to deny that MKUltra had been anything but a failed, isolated program. The media's role in exposing the truth. While legal challenges were important, the role of the media in exposing the full story of MKUltra was critical. Journalists who were willing to investigate the dark underbelly of the CIA's operations were essential in keeping the story alive. John Marks, a journalist and author, became one of the most influential figures in bringing the truth of MKUltra to the public. In his groundbreaking book, The search for the Manchurian Candidate. Marx used a combination of declassified documents, interviews with former CIA operatives, and survivor testimonies to expose the full extent of the program. Marx's work was groundbreaking not only because it filled in the missing gaps in MKUltra's history, but also because it reached the wider public, shedding light on the program's horrors. Through the media, the full story of the CIA's mind control experiments was slowly revealed, and with it, the stories of the countless victims who had suffered in silence for years. The public reaction to the media's exposure of MKUltra was one of shock and disbelief. Many Americans found it hard to accept that their government had conducted such horrific experiments on its own citizens. The shock was compounded by the realization that, despite the horrific abuse, the perpetrators remained largely unpunished. Public outrage fueled calls for a formal apology from the government and a full reckoning with the past. MKUltra's ongoing influence on government transparency. While MKUltra is often regarded as a historical tragedy, its legacy continues to influence government policy and attitudes toward transparency and accountability. The program has become a symbol of the dangers posed by unchecked government power and the lengths to which governments will go in the name of national security. MKUltra raised critical questions about the ethics of intelligence work, scientific research, and the protection of individual rights. In the years following the revelations about MKUltra, there has been a growing demand for government transparency and accountability. Survivors and activists continue to fight for the full declassification of documents related to MKUltra and other covert programs that may have violated human rights. However, much of the government's intelligence apparatus still operates behind closed doors, and the lessons learned from MKUltra have not always been enough to prevent further abuses from occurring. MKUltra's legacy lives on as a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of secrecy and the necessity of holding those in power accountable. For the survivors, the fight for justice continues, not only for their own healing, but for the protection of future generations from the abuses of power that MKUltra represents. Chapter 10: The Aftermath, The Long Road to Healing. For the victims of MKUltra, the battle for justice did not end with the government's grudging admission of the program's existence or with the handful of financial settlements made decades after the experiments. The true cost of MKUltra was not measured simply by the financial compensation or public apologies. It was measured by the permanent scars it left on the victims' minds and lives. The psychological, emotional, and physical toll of the program was immense, and many survivors found themselves not only fighting for justice in court but also struggling for their very identity, sanity, and sense of self-worth. MKUltra's experiments had been designed to break down the minds of its subjects, but for many survivors, the damage did not end when the experiments were over. Instead, the trauma would follow them for the rest of their lives like an invisible chain, linking their memories to a dark chapter in history. Even after years of public exposure and some legal victories, many survivors still grappled with the emotional and psychological fallout of having been part of such a harrowing, clandestine program. The enduring psychological toll. The psychological impact on MKUltra's survivors was profound and often long-lasting. Survivors reported feeling as though they were damaged goods in the eyes of society, and many faced social isolation due to the extreme mental health issues that stemmed from the program's experiments. Victims of MKUltra often described feeling as though their identity had been stolen from them, whether through the trauma of sensory deprivation, the alteration of memories, or the distortion of their sense of reality caused by repeated LSD doses. For those who underwent extreme methods such as electroshock therapy or hypnosis, the consequences were even more severe. The survivors were often left with persistent mental health issues, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and dissociative disorders. Many survivors reported having flashbacks of the experiments, re-experiencing the intense psychological pain they had endured while under the influence of LSD. The hallucinations and mental fragmentation they had been subjected to during the experiments often lingered, interfering with their ability to lead normal lives. In some cases, the effects were so devastating that victims became unable to maintain relationships, hold jobs, or participate in society. They felt disconnected from their own sense of self, often battling with the belief that they had been mind-controlled or manipulated into losing their autonomy. Their trauma went far beyond mere memories. It was embedded in the way they perceived the world, making everyday life a struggle. The search for identity, piecing together fragmented lives. For many victims of MKUltra, the most painful consequence was not the abuse itself, but the disruption of their identities. The CIA's experiments had shattered their sense of self, erasing or altering memories, planting false ones, and forcing them into situations that made them question their own reality. Survivors reported having large gaps in their memories, unable to recall significant portions of their lives. The trauma of sensory deprivation or the effects of LSD caused them to lose the ability to distinguish between their past experiences and the artificial alterations induced by the drugs. For some, the search for their true identity became a lifelong struggle. Many spent years undergoing therapy, attempting to piece together the fragments of their memories, trying to make sense of their lost years. Some were haunted by flashbacks that they couldn't control, while others experienced intense bouts of paranoia and delusion, side effects of the CIA's attempts to manipulate their minds. They questioned their own sanity, uncertain of what parts of their memories were real and what had been fabricated by the program's experiments. Rebuilding a sense of identity after MKUltra was a difficult, often impossible task. The psychological damage left many survivors unable to ever fully integrate back into society, leaving them to cope with their trauma in isolation. Support groups and mental health resources for victims were scarce, and many survivors did not seek help out of shame, fear, or disbelief about what had happened to them. Coping mechanisms and the struggle for normalcy. For the survivors who did manage to cope with their trauma, many developed coping mechanisms to deal with the pain. Some turned to substance abuse, trying to numb the agony of their memories and escape from the psychological devastation they had experienced. Others became isolated, withdrawing from relationships and opportunities to interact with society, fearing that their trauma would become known or that they would be judged. While some survivors found solace in therapy, others avoided seeking help, unable to confront the full scale of the damage done to them. Survivors of MKUltra often felt trapped between two worlds, one in which they were supposed to move on and live their lives, and another in which their very existence had been violated and their minds forever altered. The struggle to reconcile these two worlds was exhausting and, for many, led to years of inner conflict. Despite the immense toll MKUltra had on survivors, many exhibited a remarkable degree of resilience. They fought to reclaim their voices, to expose the truth, and to demand justice for the atrocities they had endured. The pursuit of recognition, compensation, and accountability was not just about financial restitution. It was about regaining control over their own stories and asserting their right to be heard. By sharing their experiences, they found a sense of solidarity, and in doing so, they found a small piece of the identity that had been stolen from them. The road to healing, advocacy, and support networks. As survivors continued their fight for justice, a small but dedicated group of advocates and supporters emerged to help them heal. The MKUltra survivors found strength in numbers, connecting with one another through support groups, legal networks, and survivor organizations. Advocacy groups helped survivors navigate the complexities of legal battles, providing assistance in filing claims and pushing for policy changes. They also helped create safe spaces for survivors to share their experiences and begin the long journey toward emotional recovery. These organizations played a pivotal role in pushing the government to acknowledge its responsibility for the pain and suffering it had caused. They organized campaigns to keep the truth of MKUltra in the public eye, ensuring that future generations would understand the magnitude of the atrocities committed. Survivors, with the help of these groups, began to demand more than just compensation. They sought a full reckoning, a public apology from the government, and an official recognition of the lives destroyed by MKUltra. However, the road to healing was long and unsure. For some survivors, it was a battle that would last a lifetime. MKUltra had left them with scars too deep to erase, and no amount of recognition or compensation could undo the damage done. But for others, the fight for justice and the pursuit of truth provided a sense of closure, a small victory over the system that had exploited them for its own ends. A nation's reckoning with its past. As the years went by, the psychological effects of MKUltra continued to reverberate across American society. The program's legacy shaped public debates about government power, scientific ethics, and civil liberties. In many ways, MKUltra exposed the dangerous intersection of national security interests and the potential for state-sanctioned abuse of power. It served as a grim reminder of how easily individuals could be treated as expendable tools used and discarded in the name of national interests. MKUltra also sparked important conversations about the role of transparency and accountability in intelligence operations. In the decades that followed, government oversight was strengthened and policies regarding the treatment of individuals in government experiments were reformed. Yet, the shadow of MKUltra remains, haunting both the survivors who continue to carry its scars and the broader public who must confront the uncomfortable reality that such a program ever existed. For the survivors, healing was not just about overcoming the trauma of MKUltra, it was about reclaiming their dignity, their voices, and their place in a world that had betrayed them. Though their journey was difficult, they had not been broken by the program. Instead, they had become symbols of resilience, determination, and the fight for justice. Chapter 11. The Silence of the Perpetrators. The Lack of Accountability. Despite the growing awareness of MKUltra and the emerging stories of survivors, one glaring aspect of the program's exposure is the complete lack of accountability for those responsible. For years, the U.S. government, particularly the CIA, worked tirelessly to protect the identities of the individuals who orchestrated MKUltra. Even as the horrors of the program came to light, the perpetrators, high-ranking officials, scientists, and intelligence agents remained largely untouched by the legal system. This absence of justice only deepened the wounds of the survivors, many of whom had been subjected to horrific experiments under the guise of national security. The most significant failure of the MKUltra investigation was the absence of any substantial criminal consequences for those who had played a role in the program. While the CIA as an institution was forced to admit to its involvement in the experiments, the individuals who carried out these experiments went largely unpunished. Sidney Gottlieb, the chief architect of MKUltra, remained largely free from public scrutiny. Although he had been directly responsible for many of the program's most brutal experiments, he lived a relatively quiet life in the years after MKUltra ended. Gottlieb, who had orchestrated the dosing of countless individuals with LSD and other substances, was never charged with any crime or held accountable for the damage he caused. Even as Gottlieb retired quietly in the 1970s, Richard Helms, the CIA director who had ordered the destruction of MKUltra's files, went on to serve as U.S. ambassador to Iran. The government failed to hold Helms accountable for his role in the cover-up of MKUltra, and he continued his career without facing any real consequences for the program's widespread abuses. These high-ranking officials who had been responsible for the lives destroyed by MKUltra seemed to escape the justice system entirely. The CIA's culture of secrecy and impunity. The lack of accountability for MKUltra's perpetrators is not an isolated incident, it's a reflection of a broader culture of secrecy and impunity that exists within government agencies like the CIA. Throughout the Cold War, the CIA operated under the belief that its covert actions were justified by the overarching goal of national security. The agency's motto, "The work of the CIA is, by its nature, secret and unaccountable," became an unspoken rule that shielded its activities from public oversight. MKUltra, as one of the agency's most infamous and disturbing operations, was merely an extension of this belief that the ends justified the means. Within the CIA, there was a deep-rooted culture of non-accountability. The agency routinely engaged in clandestine operations, many of which violated international laws and U.S. citizens' rights, all in the name of protecting national security. MKUltra, with its disregard for human rights and ethical standards, was an example of how the CIA's agents and scientists felt empowered to conduct horrific experiments, often without any oversight or checks on their power. The very secrecy that allowed the program to thrive also ensured that those responsible would face little to no consequences. As a result, the agency's leadership viewed the victims of MKUltra as collateral damage, individuals whose lives were expendable in the pursuit of government interests. The survivors were left to bear the psychological scars of the program, while those who had orchestrated the experiments continued to go about their lives as if nothing had happened. This culture of impunity has continued to shape U.S. intelligence agencies' operations, allowing similar abuses to occur in later decades. The power of secrecy, protecting the perpetrators. The destruction of documents and the systematic cover-up of evidence were part of a larger strategy to protect the perpetrators. In 1973, Richard Helms' order to destroy all MKUltra files ensured that crucial records of the program would never be fully recovered. By eliminating any paper trail, the CIA effectively erased the direct link between the agency's leadership and the illicit experiments conducted under MKUltra. The absence of these documents made it impossible to identify specific individuals involved in the program and meant that legal authorities would have a hard time holding anyone accountable. As part of this cover-up, the CIA's insistence on protecting the identities of its agents and scientists remained unbroken despite growing pressure from journalists, whistleblowers, and survivors. These individuals, even as their identities were slowly uncovered, were not held to the same standards of accountability that any ordinary citizen would face for committing similar atrocities. Instead, they were allowed to maintain their positions of power, often continuing their careers within the government or private sector. The absence of a public trial or reckoning. One of the most glaring aspects of the MKUltra aftermath was the absence of a public trial. Despite the overwhelming evidence of government-sponsored human rights abuses, no one within the CIA was ever publicly tried for their involvement in the program. The lack of a trial meant that no one was forced to answer for the suffering caused by the program. The government, once the full scope of MKUltra came to light, failed to conduct an official trial or inquiry into the crimes committed by the CIA. In the few hearings held by the Church Committee and the Rockefeller Commission, those responsible for the program were not put on trial or called to account for their actions. Instead, these hearings were framed as part of the necessary investigation into the CIA's activities, but they did little to hold individuals accountable. The questions asked by the committees were often vague, and the government's reluctance to provide full transparency meant that the public never learned the full extent of the crimes committed under MKUltra. The survivors, in their pursuit of justice, were denied the basic legal rights that would be granted to any ordinary citizen who had been subjected to similar violations. They were left to fight for accountability without the support of the institutions that should have protected them. In the face of a lack of public reckoning, MKUltra's perpetrators went unpunished, and the survivors were left to rebuild their lives in a world where the government's betrayal was still, for many, a painful and unhealed wound. The survivors' continued struggle. Despite the silence of the perpetrators, the survivors of MKUltra refused to give up. As the years passed and public awareness grew, survivors and their supporters continued to demand justice. Their fight for accountability became not just about financial compensation, but about the broader principle of human dignity and the need for the government to acknowledge the wrongdoing that had been done. Through activism, lawsuits, and advocacy, survivors kept the memory of MKUltra alive. Many found solace in support groups, where they could share their stories and heal together. Legal victories, though few, provided small steps toward justice, even if the government had failed to provide the closure that survivors desperately needed. The survivors' continued efforts pushed for greater transparency in intelligence agencies and demanded that the atrocities of MKUltra never be forgotten. A call for accountability in the face of power. The story of MKUltra serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked government power. The lack of accountability for those responsible for one of the darkest chapters in U.S. history reveals the systemic issues of secrecy and impunity that plague governmental institutions. Without proper oversight and without the will to hold the perpetrators accountable, the potential for similar abuses to take place again remains ever present. The survivors of MKUltra, despite the odds, continue to fight for their right to be heard. They demand accountability not only for the CIA agents and officials who orchestrated the program, but also for the system that allowed these abuses to happen unchecked. In the end, accountability for MKUltra is not just about seeking justice for the past, it's about ensuring that such violations of human rights never happen again. Chapter 12: The Global Reach of MKUltra, International Implications and Cover UPS. While MKUltra is often discussed in the context of the United States, its impact was not confined to domestic borders. The CIA's pursuit of mind control through psychological experiments was not limited to U.S. citizens, military personnel, or unsuspecting civilians. The CIA's covert activities spread across the globe as the agency sought to implement its mind control experiments in various foreign countries under the guise of national security and anti-communism. This expansion of MKUltra beyond U.S. borders led to new forms of human rights abuses, covert operations, and systematic cover-ups that extended far beyond the original scope of the program. In many cases, MKUltra's operations were conducted in foreign countries without the knowledge or consent of local governments. These global experiments often involved both foreign nationals and American expatriates, many of whom were used as guinea pigs without their knowledge or consent. The CIA, operating under the cover of national security, believed that the control of the human mind was too important a tool to be restricted by legal or ethical boundaries. As a result, MKUltra's reach was far more widespread than most people realize. Its experiments occurred in multiple countries, from Canada to Europe and even parts of Latin America. MKUltra's expansion into Canada, DR. Ewan Cameron's horrific experiments. One of the most notorious international extensions of MKUltra was the CIA's partnership with DR. Ewan Cameron, a psychiatrist based in Montreal, Canada. Cameron was a pioneer in the field of psychiatry, known for his work in psychic driving and electroshock therapy. However, Cameron's research took a disturbing turn when he became involved in the CIA's MKUltra program in the 1950s. Cameron was tasked with conducting experiments aimed at reprogramming the minds of individuals in the hopes of making them more malleable for government use. Dr. Cameron's experiments at the Allen Memorial Institute involved the use of LSD, sensory deprivation, and massive doses of electroshock therapy. His goal was to break down the psyche of his patients, erase their memories, and replace their personalities with new ones. Cameron believed that by conducting prolonged sessions of sensory deprivation, patients could be reprogrammed with new thoughts and behavior patterns. In practice, however, his methods were far more abusive and the results were catastrophic. Cameron's patients, many of whom were not informed they were part of an experiment, suffered profound psychological damage. Some patients, after undergoing his treatment, lost all memory of their lives before the experiments, unable to recognize their families or recall any details about their previous identities. The long-term effects of Cameron's methods were devastating, with many individuals suffering from permanent mental disabilities and psychosis. Yet, the CIA, which funded Cameron's research, never took responsibility for the damage it caused. The Canadian government, too, was complicit in allowing Cameron to conduct these experiments, despite the clear ethical violations. As the years passed, the survivors of Cameron's experiments came forward, seeking justice and recognition for the psychological damage they had endured. In the 1980s, Canadian citizens who had been part of Cameron's experiments filed lawsuits against the Canadian government and the CIA. In 1988, the Canadian government agreed to a settlement with the survivors, but the damage done to their lives was irreparable. The exposure of these experiments shed light on the global reach of MKUltra and the CIA's willingness to use foreign populations for its own covert purposes. MKUltra in Europe, Cold War espionage and psychological warfare. Beyond Canada, MKUltra's influence spread throughout Europe, where the CIA sought to advance its psychological warfare techniques in the context of Cold War espionage. The United States, obsessed with combating Soviet influence, conducted mind control experiments in countries that were either directly or indirectly involved in the ideological struggle between capitalism and communism. In particular, experiments in Germany, France, and the United Kingdom were carried out under the auspices of Cold War intelligence operations. In West Germany, the CIA collaborated with the German government to continue mind control experiments originally conducted by Nazi scientists. These experiments focused on hypnosis, drugging, and behavioral conditioning. The U.S. government believed that mind control could be used as a countermeasure to Soviet efforts at brainwashing and psychological manipulation, and the CIA's experiments became a part of the broader Cold War intelligence battle. The use of LSD and other hallucinogens in Europe was seen as a critical tool for gaining an edge in the intelligence world. The CIA's goal was to infiltrate the minds of enemy agents, or even to create agents without their knowledge, who could carry out covert operations under the influence of mind-altering drugs. These efforts were part of a broader program of experimentation which spanned multiple European countries, with the CIA seeking to break the psychological defenses of its targets and, ultimately, gain control over them. The use of mind control techniques extended into Britain as well. In collaboration with British intelligence agencies, the CIA conducted a series of experiments that involved LSD and other psychoactive substances. While the British government would later distance itself from the experiments, records show that the two countries worked closely together in these covert operations. The experimentation on British citizens was another chapter in the expanding international reach of MKUltra. Latin America, MKUltra's covert operations in the Southern Hemisphere. In addition to Europe and Canada, MKUltra's reach extended to Latin America, where the CIA sought to exert control over foreign governments and ensure that communism did not spread through the region. As part of the Cold War conflict, the CIA engaged in psychiatric experiments and covert operations aimed at destabilizing political regimes, particularly in countries like Chile, Argentina, and Brazil. The CIA's operations in Latin America often took the form of covert interrogation techniques, where subjects were subjected to a combination of LSD, sleep deprivation, and psychological pressure. The agency was interested in understanding how mind-altering substances could be used in conjunction with more traditional forms of interrogation to force individuals to reveal information or to coerce them into participating in covert actions. Much of the experimentation was conducted under the guise of fighting communism in the region, and local populations were often targeted without their knowledge. Many of the victims in these countries were political dissidents, activists, and opposition figures who were perceived as threats to the U.S. government's interests in the region. The CIA's use of mind control techniques in Latin America was aimed at suppressing political movements, controlling enemy agents, and even manufacturing covert operatives who could operate without suspicion. The human cost of these operations was profound, as many individuals were left permanently scarred by the psychological and physical abuse they endured. Global cover UPS and the role of national security. The global nature of MKUltra posed significant challenges for international governments. The CIA operated in secret, often without the knowledge or consent of the countries where these experiments were conducted. Even when victims from Canada, Europe, and Latin America came forward, many governments were reluctant to admit their involvement in the CIA's illicit operations. National security concerns were often cited as reasons for not taking action, and the secrecy surrounding MKUltra ensured that much of the truth remained buried for decades. In many cases, the governments of these countries were complicit in the CIA's actions. Canada, for example, allowed Dr. Cameron to conduct his mind control experiments on Canadian citizens, even though these experiments were being funded and directed by the CIA. Similarly, in Europe and Latin America, national governments either looked the other way or actively participated in the CIA's covert operations. The justification for these actions was always the same: national security. The global scope of MKUltra's operations meant that the victims were not confined to a single nation. International cooperation between the CIA and foreign governments allowed the program to spread across borders, and in many cases, the survivors' cries for justice were drowned out by the overwhelming power of governments that wanted to keep the details of these operations hidden. Chapter 13: The Conspiracy Theories and Public Perception of MKUltra. MKUltra was shrouded in secrecy for decades, and when its existence was finally revealed, it ignited a firestorm of public concern and conspiracy theories. The program's highly classified nature, combined with its unethical experiments, left many to speculate about what the CIA had truly been up to behind closed doors. The extent of the psychological manipulation, drugging, and human experimentation led people to wonder, how far had the CIA gone in its search for control over the human mind? And what secrets were still hidden, buried deep in the shadowy world of covert government operations? As more information about MKUltra came to light, public reaction was a mix of disbelief, shock, and fear. For some, the very idea that the government could experiment on its own citizens in such horrific ways seemed too unbelievable to be true. But for others, particularly those who had long suspected that the government was hiding its true actions, MKUltra was not a revelation, it was confirmation of what they had always feared. The program became part of a broader narrative of government overreach, abuse of power, and the violation of civil rights, a symbol of the dark underbelly of American intelligence operations. This chapter will explore how MKUltra transformed into a cornerstone of conspiracy theories, how public perception evolved as new details emerged, and how the program's dark legacy still feeds skepticism about government transparency and ethics today. The Seed of Conspiracy, an operation wrapped in secrecy. When MKUltra was first revealed to the public, much of the information about the program was cloaked in secrecy, and many of the files related to the experiments had been destroyed by the CIA. The limited information that was made available led to widespread speculation about the full scope of the program and the potential ongoing experiments that might still be taking place in secret. The fact that much of MKUltra's activities had been hidden for so long only fueled the belief that the government was actively trying to cover up its wrongdoing. One of the earliest and most enduring conspiracy theories surrounding MKUltra was that the program was far more extensive than the CIA had admitted. The initial disclosures suggested that MKUltra had lasted from the early 1950s to the early 1960s, but many theorists believed that the program never truly ended. Some argued that the CIA had continued to experiment on new subjects and even expanded its operations into new domains, such as using hypnosis and advanced brainwashing techniques for political purposes or to manipulate public opinion. These ideas, while largely speculative, tapped into the widespread distrust of the government, especially during the politically charged climate of the 1960s and 1970s. The secrecy surrounding the destruction of documents further fueled these conspiracies. If the CIA had gone to such lengths to cover up the details of MKUltra, the theory went, what else were they hiding? Was MKUltra simply the tip of the iceberg? And were there other secret programs being conducted under similarly questionable ethical conditions? These theories were exacerbated by the growing belief that the government was using covert operations to control both individuals and entire populations. The rise of the Manchurian Candidate theory. Among the most popular conspiracy theories to emerge from the MKUltra revelations was the idea of the Manchurian Candidate. This theory was rooted in the idea that the CIA, through its use of LSD and hypnosis, could turn ordinary citizens into unwitting agents, able to carry out covert missions or even acts of violence without any recollection of their actions. The most famous expression of this theory was the Manchurian Candidate narrative made popular by the 1959 novel by Richard Condon, which portrayed a U.S. soldier who was brainwashed into assassinating a political figure. This idea was incredibly powerful, as it played into the widespread fears of foreign influence, mind control, and totalitarian regimes. The CIA's potential to create a sleeper agent, someone who could be manipulated without their knowledge or consent, seemed all too plausible in the wake of MKUltra's exposure. Some theorists went as far as to claim that the government had already created these sleeper agents who had been activated to carry out missions in times of national crisis. This theory gained further momentum in the aftermath of high-profile political assassinations, including the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy. While there is no direct evidence to suggest that these events were linked to MKUltra, the public's growing mistrust of the government in the wake of these killings fueled the belief that MKUltra had created a network of covert agents operating without their own knowledge or consent. Some even suggested that individuals like Sirhan Sirhan, the man who assassinated Robert F. Kennedy, may have been brainwashed as part of a larger CIA operation. The CIA's denial and the heightened conspiracy culture. The CIA's denials of its involvement in more extensive mind control operations only served to feed the conspiracy machine. As the revelations about MKUltra unfolded, the agency consistently downplayed the scale of the program, insisting that the experiments had been halted and that they were unlikely to ever be replicated. But the lack of clear answers and the destruction of key evidence kept the door open for wild speculation and the belief that MKUltra was just one part of a much larger agenda. During the 1970s and 1980s, as more details emerged about MKUltra through journalistic investigations, conspiracy theorists began to argue that MKUltra was not just an isolated experiment but rather a component of a larger global effort to control individuals and shape global events. The theorists posited that mind control techniques could be used by governments around the world to manipulate political movements, orchestrate public opinion, and even create entire societies of controlled individuals who were unaware of their programming. This idea of widespread government manipulation fit into a broader cultural narrative that emerged during the Cold War, as fears of totalitarianism, surveillance states, and global conspiracies reached their peak. The existence of MKUltra seemed to confirm that the government, in this case the CIA, had the power and motivation to manipulate individuals on a massive scale. This gave rise to a new era of conspiracy culture in which people began to question not just MKUltra but virtually every aspect of government transparency and action. MKUltra and the paranoia of the 21st century. As time went on, MKUltra remained a potent symbol of government manipulation in popular culture. The conspiracy theories surrounding MKUltra became entrenched in the public imagination, influencing films, books, and documentaries. The idea of secret mind control programs became a staple of conspiracy-oriented media, and MKUltra became a shorthand for covert government abuse of power. In the early 21st century, new generations of people discovered MKUltra through the internet and media, fueling a resurgence of interest in the program and its implications. As social media platforms and online communities grew, the theories surrounding MKUltra found new life. They blended with other conspiracy theories, from chemtrails to global surveillance, creating a tapestry of suspicion about government overreach, technological control, and individual freedoms. The paranoia that MKUltra triggered was not limited to the fringe of conspiracy theorists. It began to permeate mainstream culture. The mass surveillance programs revealed by Edward Snowden in 2013 and the questionable use of psychological tactics in political campaigns brought MKUltra into the modern era, raising unsettling questions about the ongoing use of technology to influence human behavior. The lasting effect on public trust in government. The enduring influence of MKUltra and the conspiracy theories surrounding it highlights the profound impact it has had on the relationship between the U.S. government and its citizens. The idea that the government could engage in such secretive, unethical practices led to deep mistrust of authority and fueled a broader skepticism about the actions of the intelligence community. For many, MKUltra remains a vivid reminder of the potential for abuse when government agencies operate without transparency and accountability. Even decades after the program's exposure, the lack of closure and the absence of meaningful consequences for the perpetrators have left a lasting scar on public trust in the institutions that were supposed to protect American citizens. Chapter 14: The Enduring Echoes of MKUltra, Lessons and Warnings for Future Generations. While MKUltra may have been officially discontinued, its legacy endures, casting a long shadow over American intelligence operations and the very concept of government secrecy. The program, though officially shut down by the early 1970s, remains a haunting reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, the corruption of scientific research, and the violation of human rights in the name of national security. As time passes, the lessons of MKUltra remain more relevant than ever, serving as a warning for future generations about the risks of governmental overreach and the moral costs of pursuing total control over human minds. A cautionary tale: the importance of oversight and accountability. At its core, MKUltra exposes a fundamental flaw in the relationship between government institutions and the citizens they are meant to protect. When power is concentrated in the hands of a few individuals or agencies, and when there are insufficient checks and balances, the temptation to abuse power can become overwhelming. MKUltra was not just a program of mind control, it was a program that sought to control the very freedom of thought and personal agency of individuals. The chilling effects of such power remain a profound cautionary tale. The CIA's actions during MKUltra emphasized the necessity for oversight in all government actions, particularly those that involve sensitive or potentially dangerous operations. Without strict oversight and transparency, intelligence agencies can easily be allowed to operate in ways that violate the basic human rights of citizens. The consequences of MKUltra, where individuals were subjected to inhumane treatment with no recourse, have reverberated in the years that followed, showing the importance of ensuring that governmental agencies operate under the constraints of the law and the values of democratic society. One of the most important lessons from MKUltra is the need to always hold government institutions accountable for their actions. This is especially true for intelligence agencies that work in secrecy, as their activities can directly affect the lives of individuals in ways that are not immediately visible or understood. The lack of accountability that allowed MKUltra to go unchecked for so long must be prevented in the future through transparency, oversight, and public scrutiny. The ethics of experimentation, a call for humanity in science. MKUltra also raises important ethical questions about scientific research and experimentation. The program involved numerous scientific professionals, doctors, psychiatrists, and chemists, who participated in research that directly violated the ethical standards of their fields. The researchers involved in MKUltra were willing to compromise their professional integrity and the moral responsibility of science for the sake of government interests, often disregarding the well-being of the individuals involved. The ethical implications of the MKUltra experiments were staggering. Experiments on vulnerable individuals, often without their knowledge or consent, are a direct violation of medical ethics. The Hippocratic Oath, which medical professionals swear to follow, states, "First, do no harm." The actions taken under MKUltra flouted this fundamental principle, causing untold harm to the individuals subjected to the experiments. The legacy of MKUltra serves as a constant reminder that the moral compass of scientific and medical research must never be ignored. Informed consent, the basic principle that individuals must voluntarily agree to participate in an experiment, was completely disregarded during MKUltra. This is an essential tenet of modern ethical standards, particularly in medical and psychological research. The lessons learned from MKUltra must shape how research is conducted in the future, respecting human dignity, honoring autonomy, and ensuring that scientific inquiry never overrides human rights. In the years following MKUltra's exposure, changes were made to the way psychological and medical experiments are regulated, especially in the United States. Laws regarding informed consent and the protection of research participants were strengthened. Research protocols were put in place to ensure that voluntary participation and ethical treatment would be central to all future scientific work. However, as history shows, the temptation for governments or institutions to cut corners in the name of national security or scientific progress remains a real danger. Vigilance is necessary to ensure that MKUltra's abuses are never repeated. The struggle for recognition, the long road ahead for survivors. For the victims of MKUltra, the struggle for recognition and justice continues. The program's survivors, those who were subjected to the cruel experiments, still carry the heavy burden of their trauma even as the government and public institutions have largely moved on from the scandal. Many survivors are still waiting for a full public acknowledgement of the wrongs they suffered and for meaningful reparations. The battle for justice is not just about financial compensation, it is about recognition, dignity, and restoring the humanity that was stripped from them. Survivors have dedicated their lives to ensuring that the full extent of MKUltra's horrors is not forgotten, advocating for those who cannot speak for themselves or whose voices have been silenced by years of trauma. While some survivors have received settlements or compensation, the full scope of what MKUltra took from them can never be undone. As their voices continue to rise, their fight for justice serves as a reminder that, even in the face of overwhelming power, those who have been wronged must be heard. MKUltra's legacy in the modern world. As we move further into the 21st century, MKUltra's legacy continues to shape public perception of the U.S. government's role in intelligence operations. The program represents a moment in history when the government crossed an ethical line in its pursuit of control over its citizens, turning its own people into experiments in the name of national security. Today, in an age where information is power, the government's ability to manipulate and control individuals remains a concern for many. MKUltra's legacy is not confined to history. It is an ongoing conversation about the ethical use of technology, psychiatric research, and government surveillance. With advancements in artificial intelligence, neurotechnology, and data manipulation, the potential for psychological control has evolved. The question remains, how far will governments go in pursuit of power, and how can we ensure that the abuses of the past are not repeated in the name of security or scientific progress? MKUltra serves as a warning that the search for control, whether it be through drugging individuals, mind manipulation, or psychological warfare, is a path fraught with profound ethical and human costs. The legacy of MKUltra continues to fuel skepticism about the transparency and ethics of government operations. It challenges us to ask hard questions about the intersection of technology, government power, and individual freedoms, and how to maintain a moral balance in an increasingly complex world. A call for vigilance and ethical responsibility. The lessons learned from MKUltra are more important today than ever. The need for vigilance in protecting individual rights and ensuring ethical conduct in research and intelligence operations is paramount. MKUltra is a stark reminder that we must always be aware of the potential for abuse of power, whether by governments, corporations, or other institutions, and that we must be willing to challenge those who seek to manipulate and control others for their own gain. In the face of MKUltra's dark history, we must remain vigilant to prevent the abuses of the past from being repeated. We must honor the survivors, learn from their stories, and continue to fight for a future where the sanctity of human life and dignity is never again compromised in the name of national security. Chapter 15: The Legacy of MKUltra in Pop Culture and Modern Conspiracy Theories. As MKUltra's secrets slowly became public, the program's eerie combination of government manipulation, mind control, and psychological experimentation began to captivate the public's imagination. Over the years, the shadow of MKUltra has lingered in popular culture, weaving itself into the fabric of modern conspiracy theories, thriller novels, films, and television shows. MKUltra, though officially terminated, has become a symbol of government overreach and the depths of human manipulation, an image that continues to haunt the public's view of intelligence agencies and covert government operations. The chilling and controversial nature of MKUltra has led to its ongoing exploration in a variety of media. From fictional accounts of mind control to documentaries that delve into the CIA's secret past, the program has become a cultural touchstone that questions the balance between freedom and security. As the world grows more reliant on surveillance, technology, and artificial intelligence, the influence of MKUltra in modern culture remains ever relevant, serving as a constant reminder of the potential for abuse in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. From fiction to fact, MKUltra's influence on pop culture. MKUltra's enduring influence in popular culture can be traced back to its exposure in the 1970s and 1980s, when the public became more aware of the CIA's psychological experiments. As the program's details began to emerge through books, articles, and investigative journalism, the concept of mind control became a central theme in fiction. Writers, filmmakers, and artists seized upon the idea of covert government programs manipulating individuals in unseen ways, creating a new genre of thrillers, horror, and science fiction that depicted governments, corporations, and shadow organizations working in the shadows to control people's minds. One of the first mainstream examples of MKUltra's influence in pop culture came in 1962, when the film The Manchurian Candidate was released. Based on Richard Condon's novel, the film centered around the brainwashing of a U.S. soldier to carry out an assassination, reflecting growing public fears of government mind control. Though not directly related to MKUltra, the film's portrayal of mind manipulation reflected the increasing paranoia about the possibility of the government turning citizens into unwitting pawns in covert operations. As MKUltra's details became more widely known, its influence on culture deepened. Films such as Jacob's Ladder 1990 and The Bourne Identity 2002 delved into the idea of individuals who had been mentally manipulated or brainwashed by shadowy government agencies. In these stories, protagonists are often left with fragmented memories, paranoia, and a sense of disorientation, hallmarks of the effects many MKUltra survivors experienced. The theme of a character struggling to regain control of their mind has been a central thread in these narratives, often tied to government experiments or dark conspiracies. MKUltra's influence also stretches into television shows, most notably in The X-Files, which featured numerous episodes about government mind control, secret experiments, and shadowy government agencies engaged in unethical practices. The series created a broader mythology around government conspiracies and the idea that powerful organizations manipulate and control individuals without their knowledge, often using advanced psychological techniques. MKUltra and modern conspiracy theories. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, MKUltra continued to influence modern conspiracy theories. The idea that governments have the ability to manipulate and control individuals remained a central theme for conspiracy theorists, who saw MKUltra as evidence of the government's dark capabilities. This idea became more popular as the internet gave rise to a new culture of digital conspiracy theorists. Websites, blogs, and online forums began to discuss the implications of MKUltra in the context of global surveillance, psychological operations, and the use of technology to control human behavior. One of the most significant ways that MKUltra remains part of the modern conspiracy culture is its role in discussions of state-sponsored mind control. In the years following MKUltra's exposure, conspiracy theorists began to suggest that the program was not a singular event but rather part of an ongoing effort by the government to develop new forms of psychological manipulation. These theories range from the idea that mind control programs are still active today to more grandiose speculations about the use of television signals, social media, or brain-altering technologies as tools for influencing public opinion. One popular theory that emerged in the wake of MKUltra's revelation is that the CIA and other intelligence agencies continue to experiment with mind control using advanced technology and neuroscience. Some theorists claim that modern technologies, such as Wi-Fi signals, cell phones, and smart devices, are being used to influence thoughts, induce emotions, and even track the thoughts of individuals. The belief is that the government has refined the methods first explored in MKUltra and has continued to employ them on an unsuspecting public. Additionally, the conspiracy theories surrounding MKUltra often overlap with other high-profile conspiracy theories, such as those involving HAARP, High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, chemtrails, and the New World Order. These ideas are all tied together by the belief that governments, corporations, and secret organizations have the ability to control and manipulate individuals on a massive scale. MKUltra in this context is often portrayed as just one piece of a much larger puzzle, a series of interconnected operations aimed at controlling the masses. MKUltra as a reflection of fear and control in society. The enduring power of MKUltra in popular culture and modern conspiracy theory speaks to a broader cultural anxiety about control, privacy, and government overreach. As technology has advanced, so too have concerns about the potential for state surveillance and the ability of powerful organizations to influence people's lives without their knowledge or consent. The fear that governments and corporations have the power to manipulate individuals, whether through psychological techniques, technology, or media, has become a persistent part of the collective consciousness. MKUltra, with its unethical experiments, has become a symbol of how easily those in power can abuse their authority and violate the rights of ordinary people. The program serves as a warning about the unchecked power of intelligence agencies and the need for accountability and transparency in government. In a world where data and digital footprints can be exploited to track, manipulate, and control individuals, the legacy of MKUltra serves as a reminder of the dangers of modern surveillance and the potential for psychological control on a scale never seen before. The continued relevance of MKUltra in a digital age. As the digital age continues to evolve, so too do the fears that MKUltra stoked. Today, the concept of mind control has expanded beyond LSD and hypnosis to include the potential manipulation of individuals through data analytics, social media, and even artificial intelligence. The ability of governments and corporations to gather vast amounts of personal data has given rise to new fears that our thoughts, behaviors, and preferences could be manipulated without our knowledge. In this digital age, MKUltra's legacy is more relevant than ever. As we move further into a world of ubiquitous surveillance, artificial intelligence, and social media, the ethical questions raised by MKUltra: how much control should governments have over individuals? How much influence should corporations exert on public opinion? Are more pressing than ever. Chapter 16: The Ethical Quandaries of Government Research. A Call for Transparency and Human Rights. MKUltra's legacy leaves behind not only deep psychological scars on its victims, but also a profound ethical dilemma that resonates in contemporary debates surrounding government-sponsored research, scientific responsibility, and human rights. The program raised questions about the balance between national security and the protection of individual liberties, the ethics of scientific experimentation, and the potential dangers of unchecked power within covert government operations. MKUltra's abuses serve as a stark warning about the need for transparency and accountability in all scientific and governmental endeavors, as well as a moral reckoning with the darker sides of human experimentation. In a world where scientific progress often races ahead of ethical considerations, MKUltra serves as a reminder that human rights cannot be sacrificed in the name of research. The program's unchecked use of mind-altering substances and covert manipulation techniques left a trail of destroyed lives and permanent psychological damage. Yet, the absence of ethical oversight and accountability in MKUltra was not unique. It exists as part of a broader trend in which the boundaries of scientific experimentation and governmental authority are continually tested, often with disastrous consequences for vulnerable individuals. The boundaries of scientific experimentation. The central ethical question raised by MKUltra concerns the limits of scientific experimentation in relation to human rights. At what point does the pursuit of knowledge become a violation of the individual's autonomy and human dignity? How do we ensure that research does not become a tool for coercion and abuse? MKUltra's experiments were carried out with little regard for the well-being of the individuals involved. In many cases, subjects were either completely unaware they were being used for research or were not given the choice to participate voluntarily. The use of LSD and other hallucinogens in these experiments was not for the benefit of the subjects but for the purposes of psychological control and intelligence gathering, disregarding the potential harm these substances could inflict on their minds and bodies. The question of consent is fundamental in ethical research. In medical and psychological studies, obtaining informed consent is an absolute requirement. Yet, MKUltra's participants were subjected to drugs and manipulation techniques without their knowledge, let alone their informed consent. This stark violation of their rights underscores the necessity of ensuring that consent, both informed and voluntary, is at the heart of any scientific research that involves human subjects. The abuse of power, lessons for government oversight. The lack of oversight in MKUltra's operations was a key factor that allowed the program to grow unchecked. The CIA, driven by fear of communist influence during the Cold War, bypassed ethical norms, exploiting vulnerable individuals in their pursuit of what they believed to be national security. The CIA's unchecked authority in MKUltra allowed the agency to operate in secrecy, making it nearly impossible for any outside entity to hold them accountable. In a democratic society, it is essential that all government research be subject to scrutiny, oversight, and public accountability. Intelligence agencies and government-sponsored programs must operate with a moral compass that respects the rights and dignity of the individuals they interact with. And there must be clear channels for whistleblowers to report unethical conduct without fear of retaliation. The very existence of MKUltra highlights the dangers of absolving government institutions of accountability under the pretense of national security. It speaks to the necessity of having external review bodies and public oversight of intelligence operations to ensure that abuses of power are not allowed to continue unchecked. The government must never be allowed to operate in secret without public and ethical oversight, especially when the consequences of its actions involve human lives. The ethical considerations of covert intelligence operations. Another major ethical concern stemming from MKUltra is the role of covert intelligence operations in society. At the heart of MKUltra was the belief that intelligence agencies could carry out experiments and operations in complete secrecy, without the knowledge or consent of the public. This desire for secrecy, combined with the lack of ethical responsibility, led to widespread abuse and violations of civil liberties. The CIA's mind control experiments were a direct violation of personal autonomy, a fundamental human right. The use of covert operations to manipulate and control people without their knowledge or consent represents a deep ethical failing of intelligence agencies that should be held accountable for their actions. These secretive operations cannot exist in isolation or outside the bounds of international law or ethical standards. National security concerns cannot justify the manipulation or abuse of human beings for scientific research, intelligence gathering, or military advantage. MKUltra highlights the need for international agreements and ethical codes that regulate the conduct of intelligence agencies, particularly when it comes to research that directly impacts the lives of individuals. Just as there are international conventions on the treatment of prisoners of war or the rights of citizens, there should be binding standards for intelligence operations and the use of psychological experimentation. The need for human rights in government research. The most fundamental lesson of MKUltra is the critical importance of human rights in government research. Government agencies must be held accountable for the treatment of individuals in their care, especially when those individuals are used as subjects for psychological experimentation. The use of LSD and other hallucinogens in MKUltra violated the rights of the individuals involved, turning them into experiments in the name of national security. MKUltra serves as a stark reminder that human rights must always be prioritized in research and experimentation. Governments must create robust systems of accountability to ensure that individuals are not exploited for the sake of covert operations or scientific progress. Transparency, informed consent, and accountability must be the core principles of any research program, and these principles must be protected at all costs, strengthening oversight and preventing future abuses. MKUltra has sparked a broader conversation about the need to establish stronger mechanisms of oversight for intelligence agencies and government research. The lessons of MKUltra, while painful, have led to significant reforms in how human experimentation is conducted today. These reforms include institutional review boards, ethical guidelines for researchers, and laws protecting individual autonomy in government research. However, even with these reforms, the potential for abuse remains, and it is essential that vigilance is maintained. The ethical failures of MKUltra demand a commitment to strengthening oversight and ensuring that any future government research is conducted with the utmost respect for human rights. International human rights organizations, whistleblower protections, and public accountability should always be central to the process. The lessons learned from MKUltra must be passed down to future generations to ensure that such abuses of power are never repeated. The fight for justice, ensuring accountability for future generations. Though MKUltra ended decades ago, its legacy remains alive in the fight for justice and reparations for the survivors. The continuing struggle to hold those responsible accountable and to secure compensation and recognition for the victims of MKUltra serves as an important reminder that justice for past wrongs must be pursued relentlessly. It is a call for future generations to remain vigilant in ensuring that the mistakes of the past are never repeated. In the face of increasing surveillance and technological manipulation, MKUltra serves as a warning about the potential dangers of state power. Governmental abuse in the name of national security or intelligence must never be allowed to go unchecked. As we enter a new age of data analytics, artificial intelligence, and digital surveillance, the lessons of MKUltra must continue to guide us, reminding us to protect individual rights and to hold those in power accountable. Chapter 17: The Impact of MKUltra on Modern Surveillance and Data Privacy. As MKUltra became a symbol of covert government manipulation and psychological experimentation, its legacy has extended far beyond the Cold War era. In the digital age, the fear of government overreach and the potential for psychological manipulation has been amplified by the rise of surveillance technologies, data collection, and artificial intelligence. Today, MKUltra's dark legacy serves as a critical lens through which we must view the intersection of privacy, security, and individual autonomy. MKUltra was the epitome of governmental overreach, an experiment to control and manipulate the human mind, carried out in secrecy, with no regard for ethical boundaries. Today, as governments and corporations collect and utilize vast amounts of personal data, the specter of MKUltra looms large, raising questions about whether modern technology can be used to influence not just individuals' thoughts and behaviors, but their very perceptions of reality. From LSD to digital manipulation, the evolution of mind control techniques. MKUltra was primarily concerned with mind-altering substances, hypnosis, and psychological manipulation methods that, while frightening, were physically and mentally intrusive. Subjects were exposed to hallucinogens like LSD, subjected to sensory deprivation, or induced into extreme mental states, all in an effort to control their perceptions, memories, and actions. In comparison, modern techniques of mind control have evolved far beyond the use of mind-altering drugs. The focus has shifted to digital manipulation, where data is used to influence individuals' thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Governments and corporations have developed sophisticated surveillance systems that track people's digital footprints, from their search history and online purchases to their location data and social media interactions. This data is analyzed and leveraged to craft personalized experiences and targeted content, from political advertisements to product promotions. While MKUltra sought to manipulate individuals through physical and psychological means, the modern era has brought forth new, less overt techniques of influence. Digital platforms, social media, search engines, and online services serve as tools for influence that can mold public opinion and affect individual choices. In this new reality, privacy has become a major concern as personal data is continually harvested, analyzed, and used to shape behavior. The power of social media and artificial intelligence. The rise of social media platforms, where people willingly share vast amounts of personal data, has brought mind control to a whole new level. Companies like Facebook, Google, and Twitter collect data on their users, which is then used to tailor content in ways that influence thought, emotion, and behavior. These platforms are equipped with artificial intelligence algorithms designed to optimize engagement, ensuring that users are bombarded with content that confirms their beliefs and emotions, keeping them hooked to the screen for as long as possible. These algorithms often create filter bubbles, self-reinforcing cycles where users are only exposed to content that aligns with their previous interactions and views. In the case of MKUltra, the CIA sought to manipulate individuals by altering their minds directly. In the case of modern surveillance, the aim is to influence behavior by altering the information environment that individuals experience. The results can be startlingly effective. People's views on politics, their preferences, and even their decision-making processes can be significantly shaped by the data-driven decisions of large corporations and governments. The ability to target individuals with precision has led to the weaponization of data. For example, political campaigns can now use social media platforms to micro-target voters, crafting messages that appeal to specific psychological profiles. In the case of the 2016 U.S. presidential election, the role of Cambridge Analytica, a data analytics firm, was at the center of a scandal involving the use of Facebook data to target voters with tailored political ads designed to influence their opinions. This form of digital manipulation was not unlike the psychological manipulation that MKUltra sought to achieve, but it was much subtler, occurring behind the screen of a smartphone rather than through direct chemical interventions. Privacy concerns. The legacy of MKUltra in the age of mass surveillance. In the wake of MKUltra, one of the most significant concerns was the violation of privacy. The program involved unethical surveillance, with government agents secretly watching and manipulating individuals without their knowledge. Today, the tools of surveillance are much more sophisticated. Mass surveillance systems, employed by governments and corporations alike, collect enormous quantities of personal data from individuals worldwide. From mobile phones that track users' locations to social media profiles that record their thoughts, preferences, and relationships, every action, every click, and every like can be harvested and used to create detailed profiles. The Patriot Act and other national security legislation passed after September 11th increased the government's ability to access personal data without due process or oversight. The NSA's PRISM program, revealed by Edward Snowden in 2013, showed how the U.S. government was collecting vast amounts of data from tech companies such as Google, Facebook, and Microsoft. This data was being used not only for counterterrorism efforts but also to monitor and track the general population. This invasion of privacy is part of the same disturbing trend that MKUltra began. The belief that government and intelligence agencies should have the ability to control individuals through surveillance, even at the cost of their privacy and autonomy. The digital age has also seen the rise of facial recognition technology, which can be used for mass surveillance in public spaces. Governments and private companies are increasingly using this technology to track individuals' movements, often without their knowledge or consent. These systems are capable of recognizing individuals in real time, creating databases of faces that can be used for everything from law enforcement surveillance to commercial tracking. The widespread use of this technology brings with it the specter of governmental control over the populace, where every action, every decision could be monitored and manipulated in real time. The blurring of surveillance and social control. In the digital age, the lines between surveillance and social control have blurred. Governments and private entities are not just watching, they are actively shaping and influencing individuals' lives through the very technology they use every day. The influence of these data-driven algorithms on political and social behavior has led to questions about the ethics of using such technologies to shape the opinions and behavior of individuals. MKUltra's legacy lies not only in its violation of personal autonomy but in its reflection of the power of governments and institutions to manipulate the very thoughts and decisions of the public. The difference today is that while MKUltra relied on direct manipulation, the modern tools of surveillance and data collection can manipulate individuals in ways that are far less obvious. People may not even realize they are being influenced as algorithms curate the information they see, subtly nudging their beliefs, desires, and actions without their full awareness. These modern forms of manipulation raise critical questions about informed consent, privacy rights, and the ethical responsibility of governments and corporations in the age of digital surveillance. The MKUltra experience serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power, particularly in an age where technology can be used to track, influence, and control individuals without their knowledge. The call for greater transparency and regulation. As technology advances and surveillance becomes more pervasive, there is an urgent need for stricter regulations and transparency regarding data privacy and surveillance practices. Governments, tech companies, and international bodies must create ethical frameworks that protect individuals from abuses of power, ensuring that privacy rights are respected and that citizens are not manipulated for political or commercial gain. Efforts like the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, in Europe have been a step in the right direction, aiming to give individuals more control over their personal data and prevent companies from exploiting it. Yet, MKUltra remains a stark reminder that, without transparency and oversight, those in power will always be tempted to use their resources for covert manipulation. The legacy of MKUltra underscores the importance of accountability and ethical conduct in all areas of government activity, especially in fields involving the collection and use of personal data. As we face new threats to our privacy, we must ensure that history does not repeat itself and that we do not allow the same kind of psychological manipulation and government abuse that MKUltra represented to occur in the digital age. Chapter 18, Moving Forward, Ensuring Ethical Research and Protecting Human Rights in the 21st Century. The legacy of MKUltra is a powerful reminder of how unchecked government power can lead to devastating consequences for individuals and society. As we move further into the 21st century, the lessons from MKUltra about government overreach, the abuse of scientific research, and the manipulation of human minds must remain at the forefront of discussions about ethics in research and human rights. We now live in an era where technological advancements continue to raise difficult questions about how far we are willing to allow governments and private entities to go in the name of security, scientific progress, or control. In light of the dangers demonstrated by MKUltra, it is essential that we build stronger, more effective frameworks to prevent similar abuses in the future. The world today is vastly different from the Cold War era in which MKUltra was carried out. But there are still key threats to individual freedoms, privacy, and autonomy that need to be addressed. As we navigate this new technological landscape, we must learn from the mistakes of the past and commit to building a future where ethical research and the protection of human rights are non-negotiable. The need for stronger oversight in government research. One of the most important lessons of MKUltra is the necessity of oversight in all forms of government-sponsored research, particularly when that research involves vulnerable individuals. MKUltra was able to proceed unchecked because there were no independent bodies ensuring that the experiments were conducted ethically or that the subjects' rights were protected. To avoid repeating such mistakes, it is essential that we create more robust oversight mechanisms in all areas of government research. This oversight should include independent ethical review boards which must approve any research project involving human subjects before it can proceed. These boards should be empowered to halt research that is found to be unethical or harmful, and they should be made up of external experts in ethics, law, and human rights, ensuring that government institutions cannot act as both the researcher and the judge. This process should not just be an internal matter for governments, but should also include public transparency so that citizens can have confidence that government research is being carried out in a manner that respects their rights. In addition to oversight bodies, governments must also be accountable to the public for their research programs. Public hearings and documented reviews of government research practices are essential to ensure that scientific ethics remain at the heart of such programs. The lessons learned from MKUltra should compel us to demand transparency in all forms of government experimentation, especially when it involves the psychological manipulation of individuals. Informed consent and human dignity. MKUltra showed us what happens when informed consent is ignored and when human dignity is not upheld in research. The victims of MKUltra were subjected to psychological and physical trauma without their knowledge or consent, which led to permanent damage to their mental health and well-being. This violation of human dignity cannot be allowed to happen again, and we must build systems that protect the right to informed consent in all research activities. Informed consent means that individuals must fully understand the nature of the research they are being asked to participate in, including any risks or harm that may come with it. Informed consent must be voluntary, and individuals must be free to withdraw from participation at any time without facing consequences. Ethical research must always prioritize the well-being of participants over the desire for new knowledge or national security interests. Human dignity must be the cornerstone of all research. No matter the field, be it psychological studies, medical research, or governmental intelligence gathering, the integrity of each individual must be respected. MKUltra's victims suffered because their personal autonomy was disregarded, and their minds were treated as instruments to be shaped. In the future, we must ensure that all research upholds the highest standards of respect for human dignity, and that ethical guidelines are rigorously followed to avoid exploiting vulnerable populations. The importance of public engagement and accountability. As technology continues to evolve, the ability for governments to collect and manipulate data on individuals is increasing exponentially. Surveillance, biometric tracking, artificial intelligence, and data analytics all present new ethical challenges that we must address head-on. MKUltra teaches us that the danger of unchecked power is real, and that the consequences of abuse can be catastrophic. Moving forward, we must ensure that all forms of data collection and surveillance are conducted with public accountability and respect for individual rights. The concept of public engagement must be central to the discussions surrounding data privacy, surveillance, and government control in the digital age. People must have a voice in how their personal information is collected, used, and protected. This can be achieved through transparency in government practices and open discussions about the ethical implications of new technologies. Individuals should have the power to understand what data is being collected about them and be empowered to opt out of data collection when possible. Additionally, governments must be held accountable for abuses in these areas. There should be strict laws in place to prevent the unwarranted collection of data and to ensure that any data that is collected is used only for lawful purposes. Whistleblower protections must be strengthened to ensure that individuals who expose abuses of power, such as unwarranted surveillance or data manipulation, can do so safely without fear of retaliation. Public oversight can ensure that agencies like the NSA, FBI, or CIA are operating in compliance with civil liberties and human rights, building a future of ethical research and human rights protection. MKUltra's legacy is not one of finality, but of continued vigilance and human rights protection in the face of ever-growing technological and scientific advancements. We cannot afford to allow the lessons of MKUltra to fade into the past. As technology evolves and governments gain more power over the lives of individuals, we must maintain a clear focus on the need for ethical standards in research, human dignity, and the right to privacy. There is much work to be done to ensure that future generations are protected from the kinds of abuses that occurred during MKUltra. The first step is to acknowledge the mistakes of the past and work towards a future where ethics and human rights are not afterthoughts but central to all government and scientific operations. We must ensure that ethical education becomes a critical component of research training so that future scientists, doctors, and intelligence officers understand the importance of respecting human rights in every aspect of their work. In the 21st century, we have the tools and knowledge to create a future where the abuses of the past are not repeated. We can build systems of accountability, transparency, and informed consent that will guide research and government practices in a way that values human dignity. Through global cooperation and legal reforms, we can ensure that the lessons of MKUltra continue to shape our ethical framework, allowing us to build a future where individual rights are always prioritized and protected. Sleep well.